Just 7 days before I was supposed to step onto the historic campus of Spelman College, my parents looked me dead in the eye and admitted they had stolen my entire future. $120,000 completely wiped out, handed over to my golden child brother because his fake business mattered more than my real education. Then they had the absolute nerve to tell me I should be proud to support the family. I did not cry. I packed my bags and left. Years later, his little empire crumbled into dust while I was quietly making millions. Now their numbers pop up on my caller ID constantly, but I never pick up. My name is Nia, and I am 26 years old. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your worth and tried to dim your light. Growing up in Atlanta, Georgia as the daughter of Pastor Calvin and First Lady Delores meant that my entire life was a performance. Our megachurch was a monument to their egos, and inside our sprawling, perfectly manicured home, my brother and I were expected to be flawless props. But while my older brother Trey could do no wrong, I was the designated scapegoat. I was the daughter who asked too many questions, the one who read books instead of caring about social climbing, the one who refused to fit into their rigid picture-perfect mold. My only guaranteed escape was Spelman College. Big Mama, my father's mother, had seen right through my parents. Before she passed away, she set up a trust fund exclusively for my education, $120,000. It was my ticket out of their toxic house, a protective shield they were never supposed to touch. I had everything planned down to the last detail. My dorm room was assigned, my classes were picked, and my bags were already sitting half-packed in my bedroom. It was a Tuesday morning when my mother Delores insisted on driving me to the bank to handle the final tuition wire transfer. I should have known something was fundamentally wrong. She was wearing her Sunday best on a weekday, clutching a brand new designer handbag that easily cost more than my first car. We walked up to the teller window. The teller, a young woman with kind eyes, smiled and typed my account information into her computer. I stood there practically vibrating with excitement. I told her I needed to initiate a wire transfer to Spelman College for my freshman year tuition. My mother slid a thick manila folder across the polished wood table. It stopped right in front of me. I looked down at the document. It was a legal waiver, a deeply flawed and aggressively drafted contract demanding that I assume full liability for a $90,000 home equity loan. A loan that had been fraudulently taken out using my name, my social security number, and my impeccable credit score, $14. The number echoed in my head, bouncing around my skull until it stopped making sense. I laughed a nervous, breathy laugh, telling her to please check it again. Big Mama had deposited that money years ago. It was legally protected. It was supposed to be completely secure. But the teller just shook her head, turning the monitor slightly so I could see the screen myself. A massive withdrawal had been authorized exactly 24 hours earlier. I felt the polished floor of the bank drop out from beneath my feet. I turned to my mother, a cold panic rising in my throat, telling her the bank made a mistake and that someone had stolen my money. Someone had drained the entire account. Delores did not flinch. She did not gasp in horror or demand to see the bank manager. She just calmly adjusted the strap of her expensive bag, looked me dead in the eye, and spoke with a terrifying casualness. "No one stole anything, Nia," she said, her voice perfectly even. "Your father and I withdrew the funds yesterday morning. Trey needed the capital for his luxury sneaker startup. His business matters more right now." I stopped breathing. Trey was my older brother. At 25, he was the undisputed golden child of our family. He had dropped out of 2 different business programs, burned through thousands of dollars of our parents' money, and was constantly launching flashy new ventures that inevitably crashed and burned. And now they had literally taken my future and handed it to him. "You gave Trey my college money," I asked, my voice shaking uncontrollably, the betrayal hitting me like a physical blow to the chest. "You gave him Big Mama's money. That money was legally mine. It was for my education. She specifically left it for me." Delores sighed, a sharp sound of deep annoyance, acting as if I were a toddler, throwing an unreasonable tantrum. "Family over everything, Nia. Sacrifice is your duty. You should be proud to support your brother. He is building a real legacy for this family. Your little college classes can wait. You can take out loans like everyone else. I could not believe the words coming out of her mouth. I had worked tirelessly to get accepted into a prestigious institution. I had maintained perfect grades, survived their constant criticism, and held on to Big Mama's promise that I would have a better life. And they had stolen it to fund a fake sneaker empire for a grown man who had never worked an honest day in his life. I stepped toward my mother, my fists clenched tightly at my sides. "Put the money back!" I demanded, my voice rising, drawing the attention of the other customers. "Put it back right now, or I am calling the police. That is theft. You had no right to touch a trust fund with my name on it." Before Delores could even open her mouth to respond, a heavy hand clamped down hard on my shoulder. I spun around to face my father. Pastor Calvin loomed over me wearing his custom-tailored suit and a dark scowl that usually terrified his congregation into absolute submission. "Lower your voice, Nia," he boomed, his deep, resonant voice carrying across the quiet bank lobby laced with a dangerous warning. "Do not you dare embarrass me in public. You are causing a scene over nothing." Over nothing, I yelled, hot tears of absolute rage finally burning my eyes. "You stole $120,000 from me. You stole my future." Pastor Calvin tightened his grip on my shoulder, his heavy fingers digging painfully into my collarbone. He leaned in close, his breath hot against my face, his eyes cold and unyielding. "Family over everything, Nia," he repeated the toxic mantra like a weapon. "Sacrifice is your duty. You will submit to the decisions of this family, and you will do it with a grateful heart. We lead this household. What is yours belongs to us, and we have decided your brother needs it more. Now walk outside before I show you what real discipline looks like." I looked around the quiet bank. The teller was staring down at her keyboard, too afraid to intervene. The security guard conveniently looked away. I was completely alone. My own parents had robbed me blind and actually expected me to thank them for the privilege. I aggressively wrenched my shoulder out of his heavy grip, my heart pounding with a furious, almost unstoppable rhythm as I turned toward the exit. I pushed past my father and practically ran out the sliding glass doors of the bank. The oppressive Georgia heat hit me instantly, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket, but it was nothing compared to the fire burning inside my chest. I speed-walked across the asphalt parking lot, my mind racing, desperately trying to put distance between myself and the two people who had just callously destroyed my life plan. I needed to think. I needed to figure out how I was going to pay for my tuition, secure my housing, and survive now that my safety net was gone. Before I could reach my beat-up 10-year-old Honda Civic, the loud, obnoxious roar of a high-performance engine ripped through the parking lot. A sleek, midnight black Porsche Panamera swerved into the parking spot right next to my car, pulling in so close that I could barely open my driver's side door. The darkly tinted window slowly rolled down, revealing Trey. My brother was wearing a pristine designer tracksuit and a smug, effortless grin that immediately made my stomach churn with disgust. "Look who it is," Trey called out, turning off the ignition. The powerful engine sputtered into silence, leaving only the sound of my ragged, furious breathing in the heavy summer air. "Mom just texted and said you were throwing a massive tantrum in the lobby. Grow up, Nia. It is just money. Just money." I stared at him, my vision swimming. He was sitting comfortably in a luxury car that cost more than my entire 4-year college degree, a vehicle purchased with the exact funds I desperately needed to escape the suffocating grip of our toxic family. I could not even formulate words. The sheer audacity of his presence robbed me of speech. Then the passenger door popped open and Chloe stepped out. Chloe was Trey's wife. She was a white woman from a bland middle-class suburb who desperately wanted to be seen as part of Atlanta's wealthy elite. She wore an oversized designer pair of sunglasses, a perfectly styled blowout, and carried a tiny shivering dog in a canvas tote bag. Chloe loved to portray herself as my personal savior, constantly offering unsolicited, condescending advice, while simultaneously insulting everything about my culture, my appearance, and my goals. Chloe pushed her sunglasses up onto her head and looked me up and down with absolute disdain, her lips curling into a tight, patronizing smile. "Nia, sweetie, why are you causing such a terrible scene?" she asked, her tone dripping with fake sugary sympathy. "You are stressing out your parents, and Pastor Calvin has a huge sermon to prepare for this Sunday. You know how high blood pressure affects him." I gripped the handle of my car door, my knuckles turning stark white as I fought to control my voice. "Stay out of this, Chloe. This has absolutely nothing to do with you. This is about Trey stealing my trust fund so he can pretend to be a successful businessman." Chloe gasped, loudly clutching her chest in a dramatic display of mock horror. "Stealing? That is a very aggressive word, Nia. Trey did not steal anything. Your parents made a strategic family investment. You should be happy for us. You know college is incredibly stressful anyway. With your attitude and honestly your lack of presentation, a traditional university might not be the best fit." She stepped closer to me, her expensive perfume masking the smell of the hot asphalt. Before I could back away, she reached out and completely unprompted touched one of my natural box braids, twisting the hair around her pale finger as if inspecting a cheap fabric. "Have you ever thought about trade school?" she suggested sweetly, finally dropping my braid. "You could learn to do hair or nails. That is a very respectable path for people like you. And really, you should be proud that you are helping Trey build a real legacy. When his sneaker company goes global, we might even hire you to work in the warehouse. People like me, a warehouse worker." The sheer, unadulterated disrespect of her words paralyzed me for a fraction of a second. She was standing right in front of me, funded entirely by my stolen future, casually suggesting that I abandon my academic dreams to serve them. She looked at me not as a sister-in-law, not even as an equal human being, but as a minor inconvenience standing in the way of her luxury lifestyle. Trey chuckled from the driver's seat, tapping away on his brand-new smartphone. "Listen to your sister-in-law, Nia. She knows business. I will need reliable, hardworking people to pack boxes once the orders start rolling in. Just be a team player for once in your life. Stop making everything about you. Family over everything, right? Sacrifice is your duty." Hearing Trey lazily repeat that toxic mantra was the absolute breaking point. That was the phrase my parents used to excuse every single boundary they crossed, every dream they crushed, and every cent they stole. And now my spoiled brother was using it to justify buying a Porsche with my tuition money. My vision actually blurred with an all-consuming rage. I looked at Trey sitting comfortably in his stolen luxury car, completely oblivious to the pain he caused. I looked at Chloe adjusting her designer bag with a condescending smile, already planning her next extravagant purchase on my dime. They truly believed I was just going to roll over, accept my designated role as the family scapegoat, and quietly disappear into the background. "I am not packing your boxes," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously calm, hollow whisper that cut through the parking lot noise. "And I am not sacrificing my life for your delusions." I reached deep into the pocket of my jeans and pulled out my car keys. I did not scream at them. I did not cry. I did not utter another word of protest. I just stepped forward, gripped my keyring, tightly pressed the thick, jagged metal edge of my house key deeply into the flawless, glossy black paint of the Porsche Panamera, and began walking backward. The horrific high-pitched screech of metal violently carving into luxury paint echoed loudly across the bank parking lot. I dragged the key with all my strength, starting from the front headlight, scraping across the passenger door, and pulling it all the way back to the rear taillight. I left a deep, jagged, unmistakable white scar across the entire side of their brand-new vehicle. Trey dropped his phone instantly. His jaw fell open in absolute, unadulterated horror. He scrambled frantically out of the car, staring wide-eyed at the massive, ruinous scratch destroying his perfect status symbol. "What did you do?" he shrieked, his cool, uncaring demeanor instantly vanishing into pure panic. "Are you insane? Do you know how much this custom paint job costs?" Chloe started screaming at the top of her lungs, clutching her tiny dog so tightly it began to bark. "Someone call the police. She is unhinged. She is a completely unhinged animal." Pastor Calvin and Delores rushed out of the bank doors, alerted by the sudden screaming. They stopped dead in their tracks when they saw the severely vandalized luxury car. My father's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. He marched toward me, his heavy footsteps pounding aggressively against the pavement, looking as if he wanted to strike me right then and there. "You have lost your mind!" Calvin roared violently, snatching my car keys out of my hand before I could react. "You are a disgrace. You are an absolute disgrace to this family and a stain on our church. Give me your keys. Give me your phone. You are stripped of everything." I looked at the furious, hateful faces of my so-called family. They were actively mourning a scratched car more than they cared about my stolen future and broken heart. I turned around and started walking down the hot pavement of the street, with nothing to my name, leaving them screaming in the parking lot. Let them keep the luxury car. I was going to take absolutely everything else. The heavy oak doors of the parsonage slammed shut, rattling the stained glass windows in the foyer. The drive back from the bank had been a suffocating silence broken only by my father's heavy breathing and the sound of my own racing heart. Now safe inside his personal kingdom, Pastor Calvin unleashed his righteous fury. He paced across the expensive Persian rug, his leather shoes sinking into the thick fabric. His face was a mask of absolute rage, veins bulging against his stiff white collar. "You have brought shame into this house," he bellowed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You have allowed the devil of pride to poison your heart." Proverbs 16:18. Naya. Pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. You will fall, and you will fall hard. I stood near the entryway, my hands still trembling from the adrenaline of destroying Trey's perfect car. I looked at the man who was supposed to protect me, a man who stood at a pulpit every Sunday preaching about grace and integrity. "You are quoting scripture to justify stealing my college fund?" I asked, my voice dangerously steady. "Big Mama left that money for my education, not for Trey to play businessman." My father stopped pacing. He stepped so close to me I could smell the strong peppermint of his breath mints. "You do not speak to me about theft," he sneered. "Everything in this family belongs to the family. Trey is the firstborn son. He is the legacy. You are meant to support that legacy, not tear it down with your selfish ambition. I command you to march back outside, call your brother, and beg for his forgiveness." I stared right into his cold, dark eyes. "I will never apologize for defending what is mine, and I will never be proud of being robbed by my own parents." The slap of his words was almost worse than physical violence. "Family over everything, Nia. Sacrifice is your duty," he commanded, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly calm. "If you cannot submit to the authority of this household, then you no longer belong in it. Get out. You are no longer welcome under my roof. You are an ungrateful, rebellious child, and you will leave with nothing." I did not hesitate. I turned my back on him and walked up the sweeping mahogany staircase. I went straight to my bedroom, the room I had carefully decorated with college pennants and dreams of the future. I knew I had minutes before he changed his mind and decided to lock me in to force a false confession. I bypassed my luggage, knowing they would claim they bought it. Instead, I grabbed a heavy-duty black plastic trash bag from the bathroom. I moved with frantic precision. I threw in my laptop, the charger, 2 pairs of jeans, a few plain shirts, and the small framed photograph of Big Mama holding me when I was a toddler. That was it. That was my entire life reduced to a single garbage bag. When I turned around, my mother Delores was standing in the doorway. She had not rushed up to stop me. She had not come to plead with my father. She stood perfectly still, her posture impeccably straight, her designer hat still pinned flawlessly to her hair. She looked at me, not with a mother's sorrow, but with the cold, calculating gaze of a manager writing off a bad investment. "You are making a terrible mistake, Nia," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "The real world is going to chew you up and spit you out. You think you are so smart, so independent. But you are just a foolish little girl throwing away the protection of a powerful family." I hoisted the heavy trash bag over my shoulder. "You are not a family," I replied, stepping toward the door. "You are a business, and I refuse to be your collateral damage." Delores did not move out of the way immediately. She leaned in closer, delivering the final suffocating blow that was meant to break my spirit entirely. Family over everything, Nia. She whispered the words dripping with toxic authority. Sacrifice is your duty. You will come crawling back to this doorstep when you realize you are absolutely nothing without us. Family over everything, Nia. Sacrifice is your duty. The words bounced off the walls of my childhood bedroom, meant to be a psychological chain, meant to break me down. I stared right back at her, refusing to let a single tear fall. Do not hold your breath, Delores. I pushed past her, marching down the stairs and straight out the front door. The moment my sneakers hit the pavement, the Georgia sky ripped open. The thick, oppressive humidity broke into a torrential, blinding downpour. The rain soaked through my clothes in seconds, matting my braids to my face, but I did not stop walking. I did not look back at the massive brick house with its perfect lawn and its rotten core. I walked for over a mile until I found a covered bus stop. The metal bench was cold and slick with blowing rain, but I sat down, dropping the trash bag at my feet. Family over everything, Nia. Sacrifice is your duty. The phrase replayed in my mind like a broken record over the sound of the thunder wrapping around my heart, not as a chain, but as a fuel, a deep consuming obsession to prove them wrong. I pulled my phone from my pocket. My screen was already lighting up with furious text messages from Trey and Chloe demanding payment for the car, calling me every name in the book. With a steady hand, I opened my contacts. I blocked Trey. I blocked Chloe. I blocked Pastor Calvin. I blocked Delores. I severed every single tie to the people who had just tried to bury me alive. Then I unzipped the top of my damp trash bag and pulled out my laptop. The battery was at 70%. I connected to the weak flickering Wi-Fi signal from the convenience store across the street. I opened a browser and went straight to a domain registry website. I still had exactly $14 to my name. $14 in a checking account that was supposed to hold my entire future. It was just enough. I typed in a name that would soon haunt their every waking moment. Apex Logistics. I clicked purchase. The transaction cleared, draining my account down to zero. I closed the laptop, staring out into the pouring rain as the thunder rolled across the Atlanta skyline. They thought they had left me with nothing. They thought they had successfully sacrificed me for the golden child, but they had just handed me the greatest motivation I could ever ask for. I wiped the rain from my face and made a silent vow to the empty street. 1 year. Give me exactly 365 days. The countdown had officially begun. The Atlanta rain eventually dried up, but the fire it ignited inside my chest never went out. For the next 365 days, my life was a relentless, punishing cycle of pure survival and calculated strategy. I traded the quiet comfort of my childhood bedroom for a rotation of lumpy couches in cramped college apartments, courtesy of friends who believed in me when my own blood did not. My diet consisted entirely of cheap instant ramen and whatever black coffee I could afford from the corner bodega. I did not have a fancy office or a protective trust fund anymore, but I had something far more dangerous. I had absolute clarity. I spent every waking hour coding, refining, and aggressively pitching my B2B logistics platform. I targeted the actual lifeblood of Atlanta. I went after the independent Black-owned beauty brands, the local hair care manufacturers, and the boutique cosmetic suppliers who were constantly losing money due to inefficient shipping networks. I walked straight into their warehouses with my battered laptop under my arm, ignored the dismissive looks from older managers, and showed them exactly how my software could automate their inventory and cut their operational costs in half. I faced doors slammed in my face. I heard the word no more times than I could count. But every time my stomach growled, I heard my mother's voice. Family over everything. Sacrifice is your duty. Every time a potential client laughed me out of their building, I heard my father's booming demands for submission. Family over everything. Sacrifice is your duty. I repeated those exact words to myself every single morning at 4 a.m. when I forced myself awake to write more code. I let their toxic mantra become the psychological fuel that kept my eyes open and my fingers flying across the keyboard. I was sacrificing my youth, my comfort, and my sleep. But this time the duty was entirely to myself. I was building an empire on the exact same determination they had tried to crush. Across town, in the wealthy, manicured enclaves of Buckhead, Trey and Chloe were living a grand, glittering lie. They signed a lease on a penthouse luxury condo they could never actually afford. They bought VIP tables at exclusive nightclubs just to be seen by local celebrities. I tracked their rapid descent through the screen of my phone. Chloe posted relentlessly on social media, posing in tight designer dresses clutching a crystal champagne flute. Her captions were always dripping with fake inspiration, using hashtags about building a legacy and generational wealth. She loved to post videos of herself complaining about how hard it was to be a boss wife, smiling for her followers completely oblivious to the massive sinkhole opening up right beneath her expensive heels. Because behind the velvet ropes and the carefully curated Instagram stories, Trey was drowning in an ocean of bad debt. His luxury sneaker reselling business was nothing but smoke and mirrors. He had blown all of my stolen tuition capital on flashy marketing campaigns, personal styling, and renting luxury cars to look the part of a successful CEO. He left absolutely nothing for actual inventory logistics or supply chain management. His customers were complaining publicly about unfulfilled orders. While Chloe was busy popping bottles of expensive champagne for the cameras, Trey was sitting in the dark corners of those same VIP sections, sweating through his custom-tailored suit. His phone vibrated constantly. The screen flashed not with congratulations, but with furious, threatening texts from private investors demanding their returns. He was bleeding cash at an alarming rate. He was taking out high-interest loans from very dangerous people just to cover his previous debts, spinning a frantic web of financial ruin. He honestly thought my trust fund would last forever, but a fool and his money are easily parted. Back in my reality, the cold nights and skipped meals were finally paying off in ways I had only dreamed of. The local beauty brands I had partnered with started seeing massive profit margins, thanks to the automated routing algorithms I had built from scratch. Word of mouth spread like wildfire through the tight-knit Atlanta business community. Suddenly, I was not begging for meetings anymore. My phone was ringing off the hook with vendors practically demanding to use my software. The platform was soon handling tens of thousands of transactions a day, completely streamlining supply chains across the entire Southeast region. I upgraded from a friend's lumpy couch to a modest co-working space, pouring every single dollar of profit right back into the server capacity and the code. I was not playing business like Trey. I was building an unstoppable machine. It was a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 1 year to the day since my parents kicked me out into the rain when my cell phone rang. The caller ID showed a number from Palo Alto, California. I answered, and on the other end of the line was a senior partner at one of the most aggressive high-profile venture capital firms in Silicon Valley. They had been tracking my software's explosive growth metrics, and they were utterly stunned by the user retention and the raw profit margins. The partner did not waste time with corporate small talk. He offered to acquire my platform right then and there for $15 million. $15 million. It was a number so large, it would have made Pastor Calvin drop to his knees and speak in tongues right there at the pulpit. It was more than enough money to buy 10 of Trey's stupid cars. I sat at my desk looking at the blinking cursor on my computer screen. I thought about the $14 left in my bank account exactly a year ago. I thought about the rain soaking through my clothes while my parents drove away to celebrate stealing my future. I took a slow, steady breath, letting the silence stretch out over the line. I thanked the partner for his incredibly generous offer, and then I calmly told him no. My platform was already scaling rapidly, and I knew its true market value. I was not going to sell out for $15 million when I knew I possessed the skill and the leverage to scale it to $50 million by the very end of the fiscal year. I hung up the phone, a cold, sharp smile spreading across my face. I did not just want to be rich. I wanted to be an undeniable, untouchable force. And my weapon was finally ready. Exactly a week after I rejected that $15 million buyout, my phone vibrated on my desk. I glanced at the screen expecting an update from my lead developer, but instead, I saw an unrecognizable local number. I opened the message and read the text twice just to make sure I was not hallucinating. Hey, Nia. It is Chloe. I know things have probably been incredibly tough for you out there on the streets on your own. Trey is hosting a massive anniversary gala for his business at the St. Regis Hotel this Saturday night. We are expecting a huge crowd of very important investors. We need someone to work the coat check and manage the umbrellas. Trey wants to throw you a bone, since we know you must be struggling without the family to support you. It pays minimum wage, but you can keep whatever tips people hand you. Let me know if you want the shift. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone. For a full minute, the only sound in my office was the low hum of the air conditioning. Then a laugh bubbled up from my chest, escaping into the quiet room. It was not a bitter laugh or a sad one. It was the sound of absolute pure disbelief at the sheer unadulterated delusion of these people. They honestly believed I was out there starving in an alleyway crying over the loss of their approval. They needed to maintain their narrative that I was a helpless failure who could not survive without Pastor Calvin's money. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows of my commercial office space at the glittering Atlanta skyline. I had just secured contracts that would push my company valuation past $30 million before the end of the quarter. And my sister-in-law was offering me a minimum wage coat check job out of pity. I picked up my phone and typed a simple reply: I will be there. Saturday evening arrived with a humid, heavy heat. I did not dig through thrift stores to find rags to wear to fit their insulting narrative. Nor did I buy a loud sequined gown to desperately scream for attention. True wealth does not need to shout. It whispers. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, flawless bun and slipped into a custom-tailored midnight blue suit crafted from Italian wool. The cut was razor-sharp, wrapping around me like a modern suit of armor. I wore a simple, crisp white silk blouse underneath. My only accessory was a vintage Patek Philippe watch with a dark leather band quietly resting under my left cuff, a quiet celebration of my first major software deployment. I looked like a woman who owned the building, not the woman hanging up coats in the lobby. I took a private luxury car to the St. Regis. The driver opened the door for me, and I stepped onto the polished pavement, tipping him generously. The hotel lobby was buzzing with energy. A massive gold and black sign directed guests toward the grand ballroom for the Trey Wilson Sneaker Empire first anniversary gala. I walked past the velvet ropes, completely ignoring the harassed-looking hotel employee standing behind the designated coat check counter. I did not stop to grab a ticket or ask for a uniform. I walked straight into the ballroom and let the spectacle wash over me. It was a masterclass in financial illiteracy. The room was drenched in amber uplighting. Massive ice sculptures carved into the shape of high-top sneakers were melting slowly on long banquet tables. Waiters in white gloves circled the room carrying trays of expensive champagne. A hired string quartet was playing in the corner, completely drowned out by the heavy bass of a DJ spinning club tracks. It was loud, chaotic, and reeked of desperation. Everything in this room screamed of a man trying desperately to prove he had money he did not possess. I took a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter and stood near a massive marble pillar half hidden in the shadows of the room. From my vantage point, I had a perfect view of the entire circus. I spotted Delores and Pastor Calvin immediately. They were holding court near the center ice sculpture, surrounded by the wealthiest members of their church congregation. Delores was draped in an aggressively bright red evening gown, laughing loudly and waving a manicured hand. My father was puffing out his chest, accepting handshakes and congratulations, acting as if his son had just cured a major disease rather than reselling overpriced shoes. They were soaking up the validation, their egos feeding on the fake success funded by my stolen education. Then I saw Chloe. She was practically vibrating with frantic energy, wearing a skin-tight silver dress that caught every reflection of light in the room. She was holding a microphone directing the event photographer to take endless pictures of her standing next to the champagne tower. She looked manic, her smile brittle and forced. But it was Trey who caught my full attention. The golden child, the brilliant businessman. He was standing near the back bar and he looked absolutely terrible. His custom tuxedo looked slightly too large for him, as if he had lost a significant amount of weight in a short period. His face was pale slick with a sheen of cold sweat that the dim lighting could not hide. He held a glass of dark liquor in his hand, gripping it so tightly his knuckles were stark white. He kept pulling his phone from his pocket, staring at the screen and quickly shoving it back away, looking around the room with paranoid, darting eyes. This was not the posture of a successful CEO celebrating a milestone. This was the posture of a hunted animal realizing the cage was locked. I tracked his line of sight. He was staring at a group of 3 men standing uncomfortably close to his personal space. I narrowed my eyes, analyzing them. In my first brutal months of building Apex Logistics, I had physically walked through some of the roughest industrial zones and warehouse districts in Atlanta, pitching my software to independent vendors. I had seen the underbelly of the city commerce. I knew what legitimate venture capitalists looked like, and I knew what predators looked like. These 3 men were not angel investors. They wore suits that were expensive, but flashy, lacking the refined cut of the corporate world. They stood with a rigid, aggressive posture, blocking Trey's exit path from the bar. The man in the center, a heavy-set guy with a thick gold chain resting against his dark shirt, leaned in and whispered something directly into Trey's ear. I saw my brother physically flinch, his shoulders dropping as he nodded frantically. A cold jolt of realization hit my chest. I recognized the man in the middle. His name was Vance. He ran a notorious shadow lending operation out of a scrapyard near the highway. He provided off-the-books capital to desperate businesses who could not secure traditional bank loans. He charged illegal, exorbitant interest rates, and he did not send collection agencies when people missed their weekly payments. He sent men who broke things. The entire picture snapped into brutal, crystalline focus. The missing inventory, the fake online reviews, the desperate need to throw a flashy gala to project success. Trey had not just burned through the $120,000 he stole from me. He had blown right past it, trying to maintain the illusion of an empire, and he had turned to dangerous predatory loan sharks to keep the lights on. He was in so deep he was suffocating, and these men were here to collect exactly what they were owed. I barely had time to process the magnitude of Trey's fatal mistake before a sharp, heavily manicured hand clamped down on my shoulder. I turned slowly, finding Chloe staring at me with a tight, venomous smile. She shoved a cheap black polyester apron toward my chest. "Nia, you finally made it," Chloe said, her voice pitched loud enough to carry over the heavy bass of the DJ. She gestured toward the chaotic entrance where guests were piling up in the lobby. We were starting to worry we would have to hire actual staff. "Put this on. The real VIPs are arriving and they have very expensive coats. Trey wants to throw you a bone since we know you must be struggling to survive without the family paying your way. You can keep whatever tips they hand you. Just try not to ruin anyone's fur." She thrust the apron closer, expecting me to obediently take it. I did not move my hands. I simply took a half step back and let the cheap fabric flutter to the polished marble floor. I looked down at it and then back up to Chloe, perfectly contoured face. "I am not your hired help, Chloe," I said, my voice dangerously calm, cutting right through the noise of the ballroom. "And if you ever put your hands on my custom suit again, I will have you removed from your own party." Chloe gasped loudly, her hand flying to her chest in a practiced display of fragile outrage. She spun around to her cluster of wealthy suburban friendswomen who looked exactly like her, dripping in diamonds paid for by their husbands' credit cards. "Do you see this?" Chloe asked them, her tone laced with a sickening blend of pity and disgust. "This is exactly what Pastor Calvin warned us about. You try to extend an olive branch to someone who is clearly struggling. You try to give them an honest night of work, and this is the ghetto behavior you get in return. She simply does not know how to act in polite society. It is tragic, really." 5 years ago, her coded classist insults would have made me cry. I would have shrunk into myself, apologized, and let her win, just to keep the peace. Not tonight. I did not raise my voice or try to defend my dignity. I just smiled a slow, predatory smile that made Chloe visibly flinch and step back. "Enjoy the champagne, Chloe," I whispered smoothly. "It is going to be a very long night." I left her standing there stammering to her friends and slipped seamlessly through the crowd. I moved like a ghost, keeping to the shadows of the massive melting ice sculptures. My eyes remained locked on Trey and the 3 loan sharks cornering him near the back bar. I glided behind a heavy velvet drape separating the main ballroom from the VIP lounge, positioning myself just inches away from the tense confrontation. The music was deafening out on the floor, but back here the silence was suffocating. I could hear Trey ragged, panicked breathing. "I do not care about your little party," Trey Vance said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that sent a chill down my spine. The large man pressed a thick, calloused finger hard against the lapel of Trey's custom tuxedo, pushing him back against the mahogany bar. "The grace period ended at midnight. Where is our money?" Trey held his hands up in a desperate, pleading gesture. Sweat poured down his forehead, ruining his perfectly groomed appearance. "Vance, listen to me, please. I just need 30 more days. The new sneaker drop is going to be massive. The pre-sales will easily cover the interest. You know I am good for it. We are practically family." Vance let out a sharp, humorless laugh that echoed in the small space. One of his massive associates stepped closer, cutting off Trey's only exit path. "Do not ever use that word with me," Vance growled. "You are not family. You are a liability. You owe us $3 million, Trey. 3 million. Your bank accounts are frozen. Your inventory does not exist. Your suppliers cut you off last month. Your credit is absolute garbage. You do not have 30 days. You do not even have 30 hours. $3 million. The number hit me like a physical blow. He had not just lost my tuition money. He had dug a financial grave so deep it threatened to swallow the entire city block. Trey dropped to his knees. My older brother, the undisputed golden child, the proud legacy of Pastor Calvin, was literally kneeling on the floor of a luxury hotel, sobbing in front of a loan shark while his wife popped champagne 50 feet away. "I have collateral," Trey begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "I swear to God, Vance, I have real estate. Good real estate. I can sign it over to you right now. Just give me 30 days to liquidate." Vance looked down at him, his expression dripping with absolute disgust. "What real estate? You rent a condo you cannot afford. The church!" Trey sobbed, wiping his nose on his expensive silk sleeve. "I secretly mortgaged my father's megachurch. I forged Pastor Calvin's signature on the commercial loan documents. It is worth 10 million alone. And I put a lien on Big Mama House in Cascade Heights. The title was clear. I leveraged all of it. Everything is tied to this business. If you take me down tonight, the church goes into foreclosure, and my family loses everything. I am 3 million in the hole, Vance. You have to let me fix this." I stopped breathing. The air in the VIP section vanished. He had secretly mortgaged the church. He had put a lien on the only piece of property Big Mama had ever owned outright, the very house she had lived in until the day she died. Pastor Calvin and Delores had sacrificed my entire future to fund this man, and in return, he had secretly gambled away their entire kingdom. I stood completely still in the shadows, my heart pounding a furious, triumphant rhythm against my ribs. Trey had not just handed me the key to my revenge, he had handed me the deed to their destruction. I stepped back from the heavy velvet drape, letting the thick fabric fall perfectly back into place to conceal my presence. My heart was hammering a furious rhythm against my ribs, but my mind had never been colder or more terrifyingly clear. $3 million. Trey had not just stolen my college fund to buy a Porsche. He had secretly leveraged the very foundation of our family. He had forged my father's signature to mortgage the megachurch, and worse, he had put a lien on the house in Cascade Heights. Big Mama House, the only piece of property my grandmother had ever owned, free and clear. The woman who had set up my trust fund, the only person in that entire toxic bloodline who had truly loved me without conditions, had her legacy gambled away by a spoiled coward. I did not storm into the VIP section to confront him. I did not scream or throw a drink in his face. That was the kind of cheap theatrical drama my mother thrived on. I operated on a much higher frequency now. I turned my back on the pulsating lights, the melting ice sculptures, and the deafening music. I walked right out the front doors of the St. Regis Hotel, leaving Chloe and her fake wealthy friends behind in the lobby. The heavy Atlanta humidity wrapped around me as I climbed into the back of my waiting town car. The heavy doors shut, sealing out the noise of the city. I pulled out my phone and dialed my wealth manager. It was late on a Saturday night, but when your portfolio is scaling toward $50 million, your wealth manager answers on the first ring. Marcus picked up immediately, his voice crisp and alert. I did not bother with pleasantries. I told Marcus I needed to deploy $3 million in liquid capital by Monday morning. I heard the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. He started to protest, reminding me that we were right in the middle of closing 2 massive regional contracts and preparing for our next round of venture capital negotiations. He warned me that draining that much cash could expose Apex Logistics to unnecessary risk. I cut him off completely. I told him this was not a debate. The valuation of my company had skyrocketed over the past 72 hours, thanks to a new proprietary routing algorithm I had personally deployed. The equity was there. The cash was there. I instructed him to move the funds and to do it quietly. Then I gave him his exact marching orders. I told Marcus to form a blind limited liability company before the banks opened on Monday. I wanted an entity buried under so much corporate paperwork and proxy names that a forensic accountant would bleed from the eyes trying to trace it back to me. We named it Apex Holdings. It would be my ghost ship, an untraceable financial weapon designed for a single specific mission. My next set of instructions made Marcus drop his professional composure entirely. I gave him the name of Vance, the underground lender currently backing my brother into a corner. I told Marcus to reach out to Vance through our most aggressive corporate attorneys. Vance was a predator, but at the end of the day, he was a businessman. He ran a shadow lending operation out of a scrapyard. He did not actually want to go through the messy, highly illegal process of breaking Trey legs or trying to seize and liquidate a highly visible megachurch. That kind of action drew the attention of the federal government, and the IRS. Vance wanted liquidity. He wanted his cash back without the exposure. I told Marcus to offer Vance a buyout. Apex Holdings would purchase Trey's entire debt portfolio in full, taking over all the promissory notes, the forged church mortgage documents, and the illegal collateral agreements. We would pay Vance his $3 million, plus a massive premium for his silence and his immediate exit. By Tuesday afternoon, the deal was done. Vance happily took the wire transfer signing over every single piece of paper that held my brother life in the balance. But I did not stop there. The illegal underground debt was only half of the puzzle. Trey had also managed to secure secondary commercial lines of credit against Big Mama House through a legitimate regional bank, using falsified revenue projections from his failing sneaker business. I directed my legal team to approach the regional bank. Banks despise toxic debt, and they despise the public relations nightmare of foreclosing on the residential properties of deceased grandmothers. When Apex Holdings stepped in as an anonymous institutional buyer, offering to purchase the non-performing loans at face value, the bank executives practically tripped over themselves to hand over the files. They transferred the lien on the house in Cascade Heights directly to my holding company. It took exactly 4 days. 4 days of relentless high-stakes financial maneuvering while I sat calmly in my corner office overlooking the Atlanta skyline. When the courier finally arrived on Thursday morning, I signed for the delivery myself. I walked over to my heavy mahogany desk and untied the thick string holding the legal folders together. I spread the documents out across the polished wood. I traced my fingers over the prominent signatures. I saw Trey's frantic, messy handwriting on the loan shark agreements. I saw the incredibly poor forgery of Pastor Calvin's signature on the church mortgage. I saw the official bank transfer of the deed to Big Mama Home. I sat back in my leather chair, staring at the absolute power resting on my desk. For 26 years, my parents had controlled my life through intimidation and financial manipulation. They had looked me in the eye and told me that sacrifice was my duty. They had stolen my college fund, handed it to a failure, and proudly told me that the family legacy was the only thing that mattered. The irony was beautiful. It was almost intoxicating. They thought Trey was building their legacy, but he had secretly sold it to the highest bidder. And now I was that bidder. I picked up the deed to the church. I picked up the lien on the house. I was no longer the scapegoat daughter they could banish into the rain. I was officially the owner of Apex Holdings. I was legally Trey's sole creditor. I held the mortgage to Pastor Calvin's sacred pulpit. I owned the roof over their heads, the ground beneath their feet, and the very breath in their lungs. The trap was set, and I was holding the only key. 2 months passed in absolute silence. I did not send Trey a single collection notice. I did not have my lawyers contact the church board about the fraudulent mortgage. I simply let the quiet stretch out, letting the invisible noose tighten around my brother's neck. I knew Trey was likely suffering a slow, agonizing mental breakdown, trying to figure out which shadow corporation had bought his debt from Vance, and why they had not come to break his legs yet. He was living on borrowed time, and he knew it. The silence was finally broken on the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. My phone vibrated on my desk, displaying my mother's name. Delores never called me unless she required a prop for her own vanity or a punching bag to make herself feel superior. I let it ring 3 times before answering. Her voice was sharp and brittle, immediately launching into a command rather than a greeting. She informed me that they were hosting Thanksgiving dinner at Big Mama House in Cascade Heights. I told her I was busy. I had no desire to sit across from the people who had stolen my future to fund a fraud. Delores let out a harsh, clipped sigh. She knew exactly which strings to pull. She told me she had been cleaning out the attic and found a locked cedar box with my name written on it in Big Mama handwriting. She said it was taking up space. She told me if I did not come to dinner on Thursday to claim it, she was throwing it in the dumpster on Friday morning. It was a blatant manipulation, a cruel tactic to force my compliance. But as I sat in my office looking at the framed deed to that exact property hanging on my wall, I realized I could not miss this dinner. Delores was threatening to throw my grandmother's belongings out of a house that belonged entirely to me. I told her I would be there at 4. Thursday arrived with a bitter, biting chill in the air. I instructed my driver to park 2 blocks away from the Cascade Heights property. I walked the rest of the way, stepping onto the familiar wraparound porch. The house looked exactly the same on the outside, but stepping through the front door felt entirely different. It no longer belonged to the ghosts of my childhood. It was a tangible asset in my portfolio. The air inside was thick with the scent of roasted turkey and cinnamon, but the atmosphere was suffocating. I walked into the formal dining room and immediately understood why Delores had insisted on my presence. This was not a private family meal. The long mahogany table was set for 12. Pastor Calvin had invited the most prominent senior elders and board members from his mega church. Men and women who controlled the congregation finances and public image. Delores needed me there to play the role of the wayward, struggling daughter, providing the perfect contrast to her golden son. I took the only empty seat at the far end of the table near the kitchen door. I observed the room with cold, clinical precision. Pastor Calvin was holding court at the head of the table, wearing a custom suit and projecting the aura of a fiercely successful patriarch. Delores sat to his right, draped in heavy gold jewelry, nodding enthusiastically at his every word. But it was Trey and Chloe who demanded my full attention. Chloe was practically vibrating with a smug, triumphant energy, wearing a form-fitting cream dress that screamed old money. She looked around the room as if she owned it, completely unaware of the financial ruin hanging over her head. Trey, on the other hand, looked like a walking corpse. The 2 months of not knowing who held his $3 million debt had ravaged him. He had lost at least 15 pounds. His eyes were bloodshot and darting, constantly tracking the room with a paranoid intensity. He had a glass of bourbon clutched in his trembling hand, taking large, desperate swallows while everyone else drank wine. He had clearly not told his wife or his parents that their entire empire was a house of cards waiting to collapse. As the main course was served, Delores cleared her throat and smiled brightly at the church elders. She placed a manicured hand over her heart. "We have just been so incredibly blessed this year," she announced, her voice dripping with artificial humility. "The Lord has truly favored Trey business ventures. He just opened a new warehouse facility, and his sneaker empire is expanding faster than we can track. He is a true visionary, just like his father." One of the senior church board members raised his glass to Trey. "It is wonderful to see the next generation carrying the torch of success. Your father has built a monumental legacy with our church, Trey, and it is clear you are building your own. You make your family very proud." Trey flinched. It was a tiny, microscopic movement, but I caught it. He took another large gulp of bourbon, his knuckles turning white around the glass. He managed a stiff, unnatural nod, acknowledging the praise while avoiding looking at anyone directly. Delores shifted her gaze down the long table, letting her eyes rest on me. The warmth vanished from her face, instantly replaced by a look of thinly veiled disdain. "Nia," she said, her tone shifting from gracious hostess to authoritative master. "Since you are just sitting there staring and contributing absolutely nothing to the conversation, you might as well make yourself useful. Clear the salad plates. The elders are ready for the main course. And make sure you scrape them properly in the kitchen. We do not need a mess." A heavy silence fell over the room. The church elders looked at me with a mixture of pity and mild embarrassment. They were watching a mother publicly humiliate her adult daughter, treating her like the hired help in front of honored guests. Pastor Calvin did not intervene. He simply took a sip of his water and nodded. "It is good for her to learn the value of service," he stated gravely. "Humility is a lesson she still struggles to grasp." I looked at my mother. I looked at my father. I looked at the walls of the dining room, the crown molding the original hardwood floors. The house I legally owned. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. I calmly stood up from my chair, gathered the dirty porcelain plates, and walked into the kitchen. I scraped the leftover greens into the trash, feeling a deep, powerful sense of peace. I was clearing plates in my own house, serving people who were legally bankrupt because of the man sitting next to them. The irony was so exquisite, it was almost intoxicating. I returned to the dining room just as Chloe stood up from her chair. She picked up a silver spoon and tapped it lightly against her crystal water glass, producing a sharp ringing sound that commanded the entire room attention. She looked at Trey, who was staring at his empty bourbon glass, and then turned her beaming smile toward my parents and the church elders. "We wanted to wait until everyone was together to share our blessing," Chloe announced, her voice loud and carrying a theatrical joy. "Trey and I have been keeping a little secret, but we cannot hold it in any longer." She placed both hands over her flat stomach. "We are expecting a baby. A little boy. The next generation of the Wilson legacy is officially on the way." The dining room erupted. Delores let out a loud, joyful scream, leaping from her chair to embrace her daughter-in-law. Pastor Calvin stood up, raising his hands to the ceiling and loudly praising God for securing the family bloodline. The church elders clapped and offered their fervent congratulations. Amidst the cheering and the chaos, Pastor Calvin clapped his hand heavily onto Trey's shoulder. "Look at this man," my father proclaimed, his voice booming with absolute pride. "A successful business owner, a devoted husband, and now a father to the next heir. You are the ultimate future of this family, Trey. You are everything we have prayed for." I stood quietly near the kitchen door, holding a stack of dirty plates. I watched Trey stare blankly at his wife, his face pale and slick with a cold sweat. He was the future of the family, and I held the deed to his entire life. The applause died down, leaving a thick, self-congratulatory hum in the dining room. Chloe remained standing, basking in the adulation. She smoothed her hands over her flat stomach, posing for an invisible camera. Her gaze swept the room, absorbing the envious looks of the church elders and the absolute pride radiating from my parents. Then her eyes found me standing perfectly still by the swinging kitchen door with a stack of dirty salad plates resting against my hip. The joyful glow on her face hardened instantly, melting into a mask of pure, unfiltered condescension. She walked toward me, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. The room watched her, expecting some sort of gracious, sisterly inclusion. Instead, she stopped just out of reach, looking me up and down as if I were a smudge on the pristine baseboards of this massive house. "It is a shame our baby will not have a successful aunt to look up to," Chloe said, her voice sweet and carrying perfectly across the silent room. She tilted her head, feigning a deep, tragic sympathy. "We want our son to be surrounded by ambition and wealth, but I suppose we all have a role to play. Maybe you can babysit for us, Nia. We pay minimum wage. It would be a steady income for you." A few of the church elders shifted uncomfortably in their high-backed chairs, exchanging nervous glances. This was not playful banter. It was a public execution. It was a deliberate attempt to remind everyone in the room exactly where the power resided. But they did not intervene. They never intervened when the target was me. My mother let out a soft, melodic laugh, breaking the tension. She dabbed at the corners of her mouth with a linen napkin and leveled a stern, unyielding look at me. "Do not look so sour," Nia Delores commanded. "Your brother and Chloe are building a dynasty. They are carrying the weight of the Wilson name. We all have to support them in whatever way we can. Family over everything, Nia. Sacrifice is your duty." I did not drop the plates. I did not raise my voice. I did not storm out of the house. I simply looked at my mother and then at Chloe and finally at Trey. Trey was still staring at the bottom of his empty bourbon glass. He looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows waiting for the lever to be pulled. His skin was gray. His jaw was clenched so tight I could see a muscle jumping erratically in his cheek. He knew. He knew exactly what he had done, and he knew he could not stop what was coming. I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was not a polite smile. It was a chilling, dead-eyed smile that caused the triumphant sneer to slip right off Chloe's face. She took a tiny, involuntary step back, her hand dropping from her stomach. "Family over everything." I whispered the words slipping from my lips like ice water. I looked directly into my mother's eyes, holding her gaze until she physically blinked and looked away. "Sacrifice is your duty." I tasted the words. I rolled them around in my mouth, savoring the syllables. I let the absolute beautiful irony of the statement wash over me. Sacrifice is your duty. Sacrifice is your duty. Sacrifice is your duty. I repeated the phrase slowly, deliberately, letting the repetition hang in the heavy air of the dining room. Every time I said it, the psychological weight in the room shifted. It was a verbal dissection of their hypocrisy. I wanted the echo to drill into Trey's mind because he knew exactly what that sacrifice actually looked like. He knew the underground lenders he had dealt with. He knew the forged signatures sitting on my mahogany desk. I repeated it to mock the very foundation of their arrogance. They had sacrificed my future to build a kingdom of sand, and now they were demanding that I sweep up the dust. They had no idea that I held the deed to the very floorboards Chloe was standing on. They had no idea that the luxury SUV parked in the driveway legally belonged to my holding company. They had no idea that the food on the table, the chandelier above their heads, and the clothes on their backs were effectively mine to strip away. "What is wrong with you?" Chloe snapped, her voice pitching higher, losing its polished edge. "Stop looking at me like that. You are acting crazy." Pastor Calvin cleared his throat loudly, a booming, authoritative sound designed to instantly restore order to his domain. He stood up at the head of the table, raising his hands and bowing his head. "Let us not bicker on a day of such profound blessing," he declared, his pastoral voice echoing off the walls. "The Lord has smiled upon this house. He has smiled upon my son and his new bride. He has secured our legacy and guaranteed our wealth. Let us bow our heads and thank the Almighty for the bounty before us, and for the new life growing within Chloe." The church elders immediately bowed their heads, closing their eyes and clasping their hands together. Delores bowed her head, a serene, pious expression settling over her features. Chloe glared at me for 1 second longer before obediently bowing her head next to her husband. Trey did not close his eyes. He kept them wide open, staring blankly at the polished table, trapped in a waking nightmare. I remained standing by the kitchen door, the dirty plates growing heavy in my hands. I did not bow my head. I kept my eyes wide open, watching the patriarch of the Wilson family pray to a God he thought he had bought and paid for. Pastor Calvin's voice rose and fell in a familiar rhythmic cadence, thanking the heavens for property, for status, for undisputed power. Lord, we thank you for the walls that shelter us. Pastor Calvin prayed, his voice swelling with pride. We thank you for the absolute security of this family. We thank you that no weapon formed against us shall prosper. The prayer was suddenly shattered by a sound so violent and unexpected, it made several of the church elders physically jump in their seats. It was not a polite knock. It was a heavy, aggressive, deafening pounding on the heavy oak of the front door. The sound echoed through the entire house, rattling the windows in their frames. The sheer force of the blows vibrated through the floorboards. The prayer stopped dead. Pastor Calvin opened his eyes, frowning in deep annoyance at the interruption. Delores let out a sharp, irritated sigh. Chloe looked toward the foyer, her hands resting protectively over her stomach. But Trey flinched so hard he knocked his empty crystal glass over, sending it rolling across the mahogany table. The crystal glass shattered against the hardwood floor, scattering sharp fragments across the room. Before Delores could even open her mouth to scold him, the heavy oak front door swung open with a violent crash that shook the walls. The sheer force of the entry sent a blast of freezing November wind tearing through the foyer and straight into the formal dining room, extinguishing the tall taper candles on the table. Heavy combat boots pounded against the polished floorboards. The synchronized thudding was aggressive and entirely devoid of hesitation. The church elders froze in their seats, their hands still clasped in prayer, their eyes snapping open in pure terror. Pastor Calvin stood up, his chest puffed out in a reflexive display of authority, but his mouth opened and closed without any sound coming out. 3 men marched into the dining room. They were massive figures clad in dark tactical gear with heavy utility belts. They did not look like police officers. They lacked the polished discipline of law enforcement. These men moved with the blunt, brutal efficiency of people who were paid to take things by force and did not care who they had to step on to get them. The lead man had a thick graying beard and a jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow. He did not pause to take in the expensive decor or the horrified expressions of the prominent religious leaders gathered around the table. He walked straight toward the head of the table, holding a thick manila folder. Delores finally found her voice, letting out a shrill, indignant gasp. "How dare you break into my home?" she shrieked, her hands flying to her throat. "Calvin, call the police. Call security immediately. We are hosting a private dinner." The scarred man completely ignored her. He stepped right up to the mahogany table and slammed the heavy manila folder down with incredible force. It landed dead center directly on top of Delores' prized roasted turkey platter. Hot gravy splashed across the pristine white linen tablecloth and splattered onto Delores' expensive silk dress. "Trey Wilson." The lead man barked, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that commanded absolute compliance. "We are executing a high-priority asset seizure. The grace period is over. We are taking the keys to the Porsche 911 currently parked in the driveway. And we are taking the jewelry listed on Schedule B of your defaulted collateral agreement." A collective gasp rippled through the church elders. The prominent men and women who had just been praising Trey as the glorious future of the Wilson family were now staring at him in absolute horror. The illusion of his immense wealth and unyielding success evaporated in a matter of seconds, leaving behind nothing but the stark, ugly reality of a man drowning in debt. "This is an outrage," Pastor Calvin bellowed, finally remembering his role as the untouchable patriarch. He pointed a trembling finger at the intruders. "I am Pastor Calvin Wilson. You are trespassing in my home. I demand you leave this property right now before I have you arrested for breaking and entering." The lead repo man slowly turned his head to look at my father. He reached into his tactical vest, pulled out a folded court order, and tossed it onto the table next to the ruined turkey. "We have a judge signature, Pastor," he said dryly. "We can take the car, we can take the jewelry, and if he does not comply, we can take him. Now sit down and keep quiet before I decide to start seizing the dining room chairs." Pastor Calvin sank slowly back into his seat, the fight draining out of him instantly when confronted with actual legal authority. The second repo man, a broad-shouldered giant with cold, dead eyes, stepped around the table and stopped directly behind Chloe. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy-duty clear plastic evidence bag. He held it open and tapped Chloe on the shoulder. "Rings and bracelets, lady," he ordered flatly. "The diamond engagement ring, the matching wedding band, and the tennis bracelet. Take them off. Now!" Chloe lost her mind. The smug, triumphant glow she had worn just moments before vanished entirely, replaced by sheer, unadulterated panic. She clutched her hands to her chest, guarding the diamonds, as if they were her own organs. "No," she screamed, her voice shrill and piercing. "You cannot take these. These belong to me. My husband bought these for me. They are mine. Trey, do something. Tell them they cannot take my rings." Trey was trembling so violently he could barely stand. He looked at the church elders who were watching the scene with wide, judgmental eyes. He looked at his father, who was staring at him in silent, devastating disappointment. Trey realized that his entire empire, his reputation, his standing in the community, was burning to ash in front of a live audience. In a desperate, pathetic attempt to save face, Trey lunged forward. He tried to shove the massive repo man away from his wife, letting out a furious, unconvincing yell. "Get away from her!" Trey shouted, throwing a clumsy punch at the man's chest. It was over before it even began. The third repo man moved with terrifying speed. He stepped forward, grabbed Trey by the back of his custom tuxedo jacket and his belt, and effortlessly lifted him off his feet. With one fluid, brutal motion, he slammed Trey face first down onto the mahogany table. Silverware crashed to the floor. Crystal wine glasses shattered. Trey let out a muffled cry of pain as his cheeks smashed against the hard wood, his arm pinned painfully behind his back. "Stop!" Chloe shrieked, sobbing hysterically, as she frantically pulled the diamond rings off her fingers and dropped them into the plastic bag. "Just take them. Take them and leave him alone." I stood completely motionless by the kitchen door, the stack of dirty salad plates still resting against my hip. I watched my golden brother pinned to the table like a helpless animal. I watched my mother weeping over her ruined dinner. I watched my father's reputation crumble in front of the very people he needed to impress. I did not blink. I memorized every single second of their destruction. "This is a mistake," Trey sobbed, his voice muffled against the wood of the table. He was crying, actual tears streaming down his face. "You cannot do this. You have the wrong information. I spoke to Vance. I made a deal. I have an extension." The lead repo man picked up the keys to the Porsche that Trey had dropped. He let out a low, dark laugh that echoed brutally through the silent dining room. Trey twisted his head, straining to look at the man. "I have a 30-day extension," Trey screamed, his voice cracking with pure desperation. "I have an extension from Apex Holdings. You cannot do this." The lead repo man stepped closer, leaning down until his face was just inches from Trey's ear. He smiled a cruel, knowing smile. "Vance is out of the picture, kid," the man said, his gravelly voice cutting through Trey, sobbing. "And nobody gave you an extension. Apex Holdings sent us Buddy. Now stay down while we finish collecting their property." The third man released his iron grip on my brother. Trey slid off the edge of the mahogany table and crumpled into a pathetic heap on the floor. He gasped for air, clutching his bruised cheek, his chest heaving with silent, panicked sobs. The giant repo man gave Chloe one final cold look as he secured the plastic bag of diamonds into his tactical vest. Without another word, the three men turned in unison and marched out of the formal dining room. Their heavy combat boots thudded against the hardwood floor, echoing exactly as they had coming in. The heavy front door slammed shut, vibrating the walls one final time. The silence that followed was suffocating. The formal dining room was a spectacular disaster zone. Thick brown gravy dripped slowly from the edge of the table, pooling onto the expensive Persian rug. Shattered crystal wine glasses glittered dangerously across the floorboards. The golden Thanksgiving turkey, the centerpiece of Delores' perfect high society performance, lay smashed and ruined amidst scattered silverware. The house felt instantly barren, stripped of its protective illusion of wealth and untouchable power. Pastor Calvin's face transformed into a terrifying mask of rage. His chest expanded as he stared down at his golden son writhing on the floor. He stepped over a broken wine glass, grabbed Trey by the collar of his ruined custom tuxedo shirt, and hauled him upward. Calvin slammed Trey back against the wall, rattling a framed landscape painting. "Explain this to me right now!" Calvin roared, his voice shaking the crystal chandelier above them. "What is Apex Holdings? Why did those men just walk into my home and seize your wife's wedding ring? Where is the money, Trey?" Trey choked on his own breath. The confident visionary entrepreneur, the man who had mocked my minimum wage existence, was entirely gone. He wept openly, heavy, ugly sobs tearing through his chest. He could not look his father in the eye. He stared at the gravy dripping onto his expensive leather shoes. "It is gone." Trey sobbed, his voice cracking, pitching high with terror. "Everything is gone. The business is dead. It has been dead for 18 months. Calvin shook him violently. "What do you mean dead? You just opened a new warehouse. You told the board your revenue was tripling." "It was a lie," Trey wailed, his voice muffled as he tried to hide his face. "The sneaker empire was a front. The supply chain broke. I could not pay the vendors. I had to keep up appearances. You expected so much from me. I went to private lenders to cover the losses. Shadow lenders, loan sharks. The interest rates were astronomical. I thought I could flip the money and pay them back, but the hole just kept getting deeper. The debt grew to $3 million. Calvin released Trey collar, stepping back as if his son had suddenly become radioactive. His eyes darted around the room, calculating the exact level of exposure. He looked at the silent church board members who were watching the scene with wide, judgmental eyes. He looked at his son. $3 million. Calvin repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous, deadly whisper. "How did you hold them off, Trey? How did a bankrupt man hold off underground lenders looking for $3 million? Trey slid down the wall, collapsing back onto the floor. He curled his knees to his chest, sobbing so hard his entire body shook. "I gave them collateral," he confessed, the words spilling out in a frantic, desperate rush. "I forged your signature, Dad. I forged the church board signatures. I took out a secondary commercial mortgage on the megachurch campus. I leveraged the sanctuary. I leveraged this house. I gave them everything to keep them from killing me. And now this Apex Holdings bought the debt. They own it all." A guttural, wounded sound tore through the room. It did not come from Pastor Calvin or Trey. It came from Delores. My mother realized the absolute catastrophic reality of what had just been confessed. The church was secretly mortgaged to shadow corporations. The church elders sitting at her table had heard every single word. By Sunday morning, the entire congregation would know that their sacred tithes, their holy sanctuary, and their respected legacy had been gambled away by a fraud. Delores' reign over Atlanta high society was permanently, definitively finished. Delores' legs gave out beneath her. She collapsed, dropping heavily onto her knees. Her expensive silk dress soaked up the spilled gravy and turkey grease, staining the fabric a dark, ugly brown. She clawed at her perfectly styled hair, ruining the elaborate updo. She wept loudly, mourning the sudden, violent death of her social status. The golden boy she had worshipped, the son she had elevated above me at every turn, had destroyed her entire universe. Across the room, Chloe was leaning heavily against the ornate china cabinet. She was hyperventilating, taking deep, jagged breaths that echoed in the silent spaces between my mother weeping. Chloe stared at her bare hands, looking at the raw red indentations on her fingers where her massive diamonds used to sit. Her perfect luxury life, her elite country club future, the wealthy dynasty she thought she was marrying into, was a complete, total fabrication. She was married to a broke, terrified criminal. Chloe looked up, her tear-streaked face searching the ruined dining room for someone to blame. She could not blame herself for marrying a fraud. She could not blame the church elders. She looked at her sobbing husband. She looked at her weeping mother-in-law. And then Chloe's gaze snapped to the kitchen door. Her eyes locked onto me. I had not moved a single inch. I was still standing perfectly straight, my posture impeccable, the stack of dirty salad plates balanced easily on my hip. I had not gasped. I had not flinched. I had not shed a single tear. My face was a mask of cold, calculating serenity. Chloe panic froze. The rapid rise and fall of her chest stopped. Her tear-filled eyes narrowed, zeroing in on my face. She processed the total absence of shock in my expression. Her mind desperately needed a target, and the toxic conditioning of this family provided the perfect scapegoat. Chloe raised a shaking finger and pointed it directly at my chest. "This is her fault," Chloe screamed, her voice shrill and piercing. The room went dead silent. Even Delores stopped wailing, looking up from the gravy-stained rug. "This is all your fault, Nia," Chloe shrieked, taking a step toward me. "If you had just supported the business instead of being a selfish runaway, Trey would not have had to take out those loans. You abandoned your family. You hoarded your money. You moved to the city and got a corporate job while your brother was drowning. If you had just given him your college fund willingly, if you had just co-signed his initial credit lines, none of this would have happened. You forced him to go to those loan sharks. You ruined us." It was a breathtaking display of psychological gymnastics. Chloe had somehow twisted Trey's $3 million fraud and forgery into my personal failure. In any rational room, she would have been laughed into silence. But this was not a rational room. This was the Wilson household. Pastor Calvin's eyes locked onto me. The desperation in his face morphed into a sudden, terrifying clarity. Chloe twisted logic, offered him a lifeline, a way to preserve his precious son and save his megachurch. He violently agreed with her. "She is right," Calvin bellowed, his booming preacher voice returning in full force. He marched toward me, his heavy footsteps crushing the broken crystal on the floor. He cornered me against the swinging kitchen door, his massive frame blocking my exit. "You work in logistics," Calvin stated, his voice rapid and demanding. "You have a high-paying corporate job. You live in a luxury apartment. You have no debt. You have a pristine, clean credit score. You are going to fix this, Nia. You owe this family for raising you. You owe this church for providing your spiritual foundation." I looked up at him, maintaining my dead-eyed smile. I did not speak. I simply watched a desperate man try to command a God he did not realize he was praying to. "You are going to take out personal loans," Calvin ordered, stepping closer until I could smell the mint on his breath. "You are going to leverage your corporate salary. You will secure secondary mortgages under your name. We can consolidate the church debt if we have a clean guarantor. You will save your brother lifestyle. You will save my church. It is your duty as a daughter." Calvin turned and marched over to Trey's discarded leather briefcase resting near the fallen chair. He snapped the clasps open and frantically dug through the compartments. He pulled out a thick stack of paperwork. They were blank applications for high-interest predatory commercial loans, the exact kind of financial poison Trey had been using to keep himself afloat. Pastor Calvin marched back across the room and shoved the stack of papers against my chest, pinning them between my arm and the dirty salad plates. He pulled a heavy gold pen from his inner suit pocket and thrust it toward my face. "Sign them," Calvin commanded, his voice echoing with absolute desperate authority. "Now." I did not take the gold pen. I looked at the heavy, gleaming metal inches from my eyes, and then I looked past it into the panicked, sweating face of the man holding it. Pastor Calvin Wilson, the patriarch, the man who built an empire on faith and financed it on fraud. He pressed the thick stack of predatory loan applications harder against my chest, demanding my absolute submission. He expected compliance. He expected obedience. He expected the quiet, dutiful daughter who had always absorbed the family debts, the family sins, the family shame. I was the safety net. I had always been the safety net. When Trey wrecked his first luxury car, I was the one who lost my college savings to quietly pay off the settlement. I was the safety net. When Trey failed his first semester of business school, I was the one who worked double shifts to cover his penthouse rent so Calvin would not find out. I was the safety net. I had always been the safety net. Slowly, deliberately, I shifted my weight. I reached out and took the gold pen from my father's trembling hand. A collective sigh of relief rippled through the ruined dining room. I heard Chloe let out a shaky, breathless laugh, her panic momentarily subsiding. I saw Delores wipe a smear of gravy from her tear-stained cheek, her eyes locking onto me with sudden triumphant expectation. They thought I was breaking. They thought the conditioning of 25 years was finally kicking in. They thought I would bleed my own life dry to save their golden boy one more time. I set the gold pen down on the edge of the mahogany table. It rolled slightly, coming to a stop against a shattered piece of crystal. I turned and placed the stack of dirty salad plates onto the buffet counter. Then I took the thick stack of loan applications in both my hands. The paper felt heavy, rough, loaded with ruinous interest rates and absolute financial destruction. I read the bold print at the top, identifying the secondary lending division. This was my life they were asking for. This was my clean credit, my corporate salary, my entire future they were demanding I sign away to cover $3 million of criminal debt. I looked at Trey, still shivering on the floor, a pathetic puddle of a man who had built his entire identity on stolen money and my stolen opportunities. I looked at Chloe, clutching her bare fingers, mourning the loss of diamonds paid for with forged megachurch mortgages. I looked at Delores, kneeling in the wreckage of her perfect high society Thanksgiving dinner, her illusion of wealth completely shattered. I looked at Calvin, a false prophet demanding a human sacrifice to save his crumbling temple. My hands tightened on the edges of the applications. I twisted my wrists and tore the thick stack of papers straight down the middle. The sharp tearing sound ripped through the silent dining room like a gunshot. Calvin's eyes widened in absolute shock. I placed the two torn halves together and ripped them again, applying every ounce of strength I had until the predatory commercial loans were nothing but jagged, useless confetti. I opened my hands and let the shredded paper flutter down onto the gravy-soaked Persian rug, raining down over Trey's expensive leather shoes. "You stole my future for his ego," I said, my voice low, calm, and carrying absolute finality. "I won't set myself on fire to keep your lies warm." The words hung in the air, heavy and immovable. I watched the realization physically strike them. I was not the safety net anymore. I would never be the safety net again. "You stole my college fund to buy him his first warehouse," I continued, my voice steady, cutting through the suffocating silence. "You stole my future for his ego. You took out credit cards in my name when I was 18 to fund his initial marketing campaigns and left me to fight off the collection agencies. You demanded my absolute sacrifice for his absolute comfort. You stole my future for his ego. And now you stand in the ruins of your own making and demand that I chain myself to a $3 million anchor to save a megachurch built on lies." No. The answer is no. Today is the day the golden boy pays his own debts. Calvin's face turned a dangerous mottled shade of purple. The veins in his thick neck bulged against his starched white collar. He opened his mouth to scream, but no words came out. The great orator, the master manipulator, was completely paralyzed by a refusal he had never anticipated. He stepped backward, his hands shaking uselessly at his sides. But Delores was not paralyzed. Delores was entirely consumed by the violent, sudden death of her social empire. She scrambled up from the floor, her expensive silk dress dripping with brown turkey grease and smashed potatoes. She marched across the dining room, her eyes wide and wild, her teeth bared in a feral grimace. She did not hesitate. She did not speak. She simply pulled her arm back and brought her hand across my face with every ounce of physical force she possessed. The slap was vicious. The sharp, brutal crack of her palm striking my cheekbone echoed loudly against the high ceiling of the empty room. The sheer impact of the blow snapped my head sharply to the side. The sting was immediate, radiating hot and bright across my skin, blurring my vision for a fraction of a second. The physical shock rippled down my neck, but I locked my knees, forcing myself to remain rooted to the exact spot. "You ungrateful wretch!" Delores screamed, her voice raw and tearing at the edges. Spittle flew from her lips as she leaned into my space, her face twisted in pure, unadulterated hatred. "You are no longer my daughter. You are nothing to this family. You are nothing." The echo of her scream faded, leaving behind only the sound of Trey whimpering on the floor and Chloe jagged, frantic breathing. The remaining church elders, who had not yet fled the house, stared in horrified silence. They waited for my reaction. They waited for the tears. They waited for the inevitable collapse of the scapegoat daughter who had just been formally banished from the kingdom. I slowly turned my head back to face her. I raised my hand and gently touched my burning cheek. My fingertips grazed the hot red skin, feeling the outline of her handprint already beginning to swell. The pain was sharp, but it was entirely superficial. Inside, I felt nothing but cold, absolute clarity. I lowered my hand. I did not blink. I did not step back. I looked at my mother completely and utterly unfazed. The dead-eyed smile returned to my lips, colder and sharper than before. I reached into the pocket of my tailored slacks and pulled out my smartphone. I kept my eyes locked on Delores as I raised the screen. I tapped the home automation application icon. I bypassed the standard controls and pressed the master security override button. A heavy mechanical clunk echoed loudly through the massive house, then another, and another. The heavy steel deadbolts on the solid oak front door, the back patio French doors, the garage entrance, and the side security gates simultaneously slammed into place. I locked the smart locks on every single exit, sealing the perimeter. The digital security chimes echoed pleasantly through the foyer, confirming the house was on total lockdown. They were trapped, and they were trapped with me. The heavy electronic deadbolts sliding into place sounded like a prison cell slamming shut. The metallic clunk echoed through the ruined dining room, sealing us inside. I stood perfectly still, my hand resting casually by my side, watching the immediate visceral reaction to the sound of the locks. Calvin lunged for this kitchen door. He grabbed the brass handle and twisted it violently. Locked. He pounded his heavy fist against the solid oak. Locked. He turned around, his chest heaving, his authority entirely evaporated. He marched to the French doors leading to the patio and yanked at the handles. Locked. He was locked in. They were all locked in. The patriarch of the Wilson family, the man who commanded thousands from his pulpit, was suddenly a prisoner in his own dining room. Delores backed away from me, her hands trembling as she clutched the gravy-stained fabric of her ruined silk dress. She stared at the digital keypad on the wall, its red light blinking ominously, signaling the absolute lockdown. She had slapped me to establish dominance. She had slapped me to put me in my place. She had slapped me to remind me I was nothing. But the red light on the keypad told a different story. The red light told her she was no longer in control. Chloe, however, was not looking at the doors. Her frantic, tear-filled eyes had dropped to my side. She was staring at my bag. It was sitting on the edge of a side table where I had placed it upon entering. To Calvin and Delores, it was just a black purse. But Chloe had spent her entire adult life studying the architecture of wealth. She had trained her eyes to spot the invisible markers of high society. She recognized the flawless, unbranded matte leather. She recognized the meticulous hand-stitching. She recognized the bespoke palladium hardware. She recognized the custom Hermes Birkin, a special order piece that required a massive multi-million-dollar purchase history just to be invited to buy. Chloe's breath hitched in her throat. Her eyes darted from the bag to my face, then back to the bag. She knew the value. It was worth more than the repossessed Porsche. It was worth more than her seized diamond ring. It was worth more than Trey's entire fabricated existence. The broke sister did not carry a custom Birkin. The broke sister did not own limited edition luxury assets. The minimum wage scapegoat did not lock down a multi-million-dollar smart house with her personal cell phone. I watched her mind break as the math finally calculated in her head. Her jaw trembled, her eyes widening in absolute silent horror. I stepped away from the wall. I walked over to the side table. I reached into the matte black leather of the bag. My hand bypassed my keys. My hand bypassed my wallet. My hand wrapped around a thick, heavy stack of premium legal parchment. I pulled out a dossier. It was bound tightly with a thick crimson ribbon and sealed with a heavy, dark red wax stamp. The wax was pristine, untouched, radiating a terrifying, absolute authority. I held it up. The room went entirely still. The screaming stopped. The crying stopped. The desperate rattling of the doors stopped. The panic subsided into a cold, breathless dread. They did not know what the dossier was, but the primal fear in their eyes told me they knew it was their execution. I walked slowly toward the center of the room. The crunch of broken crystal beneath my shoes was the only sound. I stopped at the head of the mahogany table, right next to the smashed, ruined Thanksgiving turkey. I raised the heavy dossier over the spilled gravy. I opened my hand. I let it drop. It hit the wood with a heavy final thud. I looked at my mother. Her chest was rising and falling in shallow, panicked gasps. Her eyes were wide with a terror she could no longer mask beneath her high society arrogance. I looked at the woman who had just struck me, the woman who had just formally banished me from a kingdom that was already burning to the ground. She had called me an ungrateful wretch. She had called me nothing. "You are right, Delores," I said, my voice echoing off the high ceiling, smooth as glass and cold as ice. "I am not your daughter. I am your landlord." Delores recoiled as if the words themselves were physical blows. She stumbled backward, bumping into a dining chair, her mouth opening and closing in silent, absolute shock. Calvin froze, his hand dropping from the locked patio door, his face draining of all color. He stared at me as if he were looking at a ghost, a demon he had accidentally summoned into his home. But Trey, still kneeling on the floor, slowly pulled himself up. He used the edge of the gravy-stained table to support his trembling weight. His bruised face was pale, his eyes bloodshot and swollen from his pathetic weeping. He stared at the red wax seal. He stared at the crimson ribbon. He reached out with a shaking, sweaty hand. He pulled the ribbon. The wax seal cracked. The sound was deafening in the dead silence of the dining room. He flipped open the heavy cover. He read the first page. He read the bold black ink. He read the transfer of deeds. He read the assignment of debt. He read the corporate signatures. He read the total acquisition of the secondary commercial mortgages. He read the documents transferring the mega church sanctuary, the administrative buildings, and the very house we were standing in. He read his own ruin. He read his father's ruin. He read his family ruin. I owned their debt. I owned their sanctuary. I owned their home. I owned the very floorboards Trey was currently crying on. Trey's knees buckled. He did not slide to the floor this time. He simply collapsed, hitting the hardwood with a sickening, heavy thud. The dossier slipped from his fingers, scattering across the ruined table, the corporate letterhead clearly visible under the chandelier light. He looked up at me, his eyes entirely vacant, his mind completely broken by the words printed on the page. Apex. Trey whispered the word, bleeding out of his mouth like a dying breath. "You are Apex Holdings." I looked down at my brother, my expression completely unchanged. I did not gloat. I did not raise my voice. I simply let the absolute weight of his failure settle over him. "Yes, Trey." I said my words, clipping through the suffocating silence of the dining room. "I am Apex Holdings. I am the shadow entity you have been terrified of for the past 6 months." I took a slow, deliberate step forward, my heels crunching over a shattered crystal goblet. "You really thought you were a genius, Trey. You thought you could outsmart the market. But you left a paper trail a mile wide. When you first launched that luxury sneaker line, you bragged about your manufacturing deals in Italy. I checked the customs manifests. There were no shipments. There were no Italian factories. You were drop-shipping cheap materials from overseas and slapping a premium logo on them." Trey curled tighter into himself, letting out a pathetic whimpering sound. "When your inventory got seized at the border because you failed to pay the basic import tariffs, you panicked," I continued, my voice echoing against the high walls. "You needed cash to refund the pre-orders, so you went to a high-risk bridge lender. You took out $500,000 at an absurd 20% interest rate. But you did not pay off the angry customers. You used that money to lease a brand new warehouse and buy a customized Porsche to maintain your illusion of success." Calvin was breathing heavily, staring at his son in absolute disgust. Delores had gone entirely mute, clutching the edge of a chair. "You tried to cover the bridge loan with a series of smaller, predatory commercial lines of credit," I said, dissecting his ruin piece by piece. "But the interest compounded. You started taking from the business accounts to cover your personal lifestyle. The country club dues, the custom suits, the diamond ring on your wife finger. Within 12 months you were bleeding cash. When the shadow lenders started threatening you physically, you got desperate." I turned my gaze to Pastor Calvin. The great patriarch looked like a deflated balloon. That is when you forged your father's signature, Trey. I said, my voice dropping to a deadly calm. You created dummy LLCs to hide the paper trail. You leveraged the megachurch campus. You put up the sanctuary as collateral. You mortgaged this house. You handed over $3 million worth of hard assets to a group of men who would have happily burned this property to the ground to collect. Calvin stumbled backward heavily, his legs hitting the edge of the mahogany table. He sank into his high-backed chair, his chest heaving. The realization was finally penetrating his thick, arrogant skull. The men you borrowed from are ruthless, Trey, but they are also impatient, I explained, pacing slowly around the ruined Thanksgiving turkey. They did not want to go through a messy public foreclosure on a high-profile megachurch. It attracts too much media attention. It attracts the federal authorities. They just wanted their money back. So when my corporate acquisitions team approached them 3 weeks ago and offered to buy your debt outright, they jumped at the chance. I bought your $3 million loans for pennies on the dollar. I bought your absolute ruin for pocket change. Pastor Calvin gripped the armrests of his chair, his knuckles turning white. He stared at the red-sealed dossier lying open on the table. The words printed on the parchment were undeniable. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a terrifying new understanding. You own the mortgage. Calvin choked out the words, scraping against his throat like sandpaper. You own the debt on the sanctuary. I hold the deed to the church campus. I corrected him, my tone perfectly flat. I hold the primary note on this house. I own the administrative buildings. I own the parking lots. I own the ground you stand on to preach every Sunday morning. You do not answer to the bank, Calvin. You do not answer to the board of elders. You answer to me. The power dynamic in the room inverted with a violent, sickening snap. The patriarch, the man who had demanded my absolute submission, who had stood by while his wife slapped me across the face, was now nothing more than my tenant. He was a tenant who was 3 months in arrears on a fraudulent mortgage. I could evict him with a single phone call. I could padlock the doors to his megachurch by Monday morning. I could hand the forged documents over to the district attorney and watch him lose his entire legacy. I could leave him and his golden boy homeless and destitute in the streets of Atlanta. Calvin opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The great orator was completely silenced by the magnitude of his own destruction. Delores was weeping silently into her hands, her perfect world shattered beyond repair. Then a sudden frantic movement caught my eye. Chloe pushed herself away from the china cabinet. She stepped over the puddles of brown gravy and broken glass, ignoring her husband who was still sobbing on the hardwood floor. She practically ran toward me, stopping just inches away. The panic that had consumed her face just moments before was entirely gone. It had been replaced by a sickeningly sweet, desperate smile. Her eyes darted over my designer clothes, my flawless posture, the bespoke leather bag resting on the side table. She was recalculating her survival strategy in real time. She was married to a broke criminal, and she knew her only path to salvation stood right in front of her. Chloe reached out her hands, trembling slightly, and gently grasped my forearm. Her touch felt like a crawling insect, but I did not pull away. I simply stared at her, waiting for the performance. Nia, sweetie, Chloe said, her voice dripping with artificial warmth and desperate affection. We are sisters. We can work this out. For the baby. I looked down at the trembling hand resting on my forearm. Chloe, manicured nails dug into my sleeve, her eyes wide with a desperate, frantic pleading. I did not shake her off. I simply stared at her hand until she felt the sheer absolute coldness of my gaze. Slowly, she pulled her fingers away, retreating a half-step backward. Sisters, I repeated. The word tasted like ash in the silent room. You want to invoke family now, Chloe. You want to use the child growing in your stomach as a human shield against a financial execution. I reached into the matte, black leather of my bag. I bypassed my wallet and pulled out a sleek metallic cylinder. A portable high-definition smart projector. I set it upright on the mahogany table right beside the red-sealed Apex dossier. I tapped the screen of my phone, syncing the devices. A stark, bright white light beamed directly onto the dark floral wallpaper of the formal dining room, illuminating the space above the shattered china cabinet. "You are right about one thing, Chloe," I said, my voice dropping to a low, terrifying calm. "Family is everything. Family is about knowing exactly who you are sitting across from at the table." I pressed play on my phone. The audio recording was crystal clear, captured by the high-end security system I had quietly installed in my own apartment months ago. Trey's voice filled the dining room, arrogant and dripping with entitlement. "Naya will co-sign. He has to. It is her purpose in this family. She is the worker bee. She exists to fund my vision." Then came Chloe, voice her high-pitched, grating laugh echoing off the walls. "Thank God for the worker bees. Someone has to pay for the honey. At least she is good for something. The help usually is." The audio skipped forward, a clean edit jumping to the coat check incident from just a few hours ago. Chloe's voice played again, condescending and sharp. "Can you take my coat?" "Oh wait, you are not the coat check girl. You just look like them. The help." I tapped the screen, stopping the playback. The heavy, suffocating silence returned. Chloe went chalk white. The blood drained from her face, leaving her looking sickly and hollow. The fake sweet smile melted off her perfectly contoured features. She opened her mouth to speak, but her throat simply clicked. "That is what I am to you," I said, stepping slowly toward her. "The help, the worker bee, the dark-skinned scapegoat you can mock in private and extort in public. You came into this house waving your progressive politics around like a weapon. You played the perfect educated liberal ally. You attended the charity galas. You posted the black squares on your social media. You quoted civil rights leaders while actively referring to your black sister-in-law as the help." "Nia, that was a joke," Chloe stammered, taking another step back, her heels crunching on broken glass. "You are taking it out of context. I am a good person." "You are a parasite," I corrected her smoothly. "But what fascinates me most about you, Chloe, is not your casual racism or your staggering hypocrisy. It is your absolute sheer audacity to play a game you cannot afford." I tapped my phone screen again. The audio interface vanished. In its place, the projector beamed a series of high-resolution documents onto the floral wallpaper. Bank statements, birth certificates, deep background checks. "You sold this family a fantastic story," I said, projecting my voice so every remaining church elder could hear the total destruction of the Wilson legacy. "You told Delores you were a Vanderbilt-adjacent trust fund heiress. You bragged about your generational wealth. You complained about the heavy burden of managing your family offshore accounts. You demanded a $200,000 wedding because it was the standard you were accustomed to living." Chloe shook her head frantically, her hands flying up to cover her face. "Stop! Turn that off! Your real name is Clarissa Miller," I stated, reading from the projected screen. "Your parents are retired postal workers in Akron, Ohio. They live in a rented duplex. You do not have a trust fund. You do not have offshore accounts. You have $80,000 in consumer credit card debt." A collective gasp ripped through the room. Delores looked up from the gravy-stained rug, her eyes bulging out of her head. Calvin gripped the edge of the table, staring at the screen in absolute horror. "You leased the luxury cars?" I continued, relentlessly swiping to the next document. "You rented the designer bags through a subscription service. You bought cubic zirconia and passed it off as heirloom diamonds. You are a complete, total financial fabrication. You maxed out 6 different credit cards to buy access to Atlanta high society, hoping to trap a millionaire before the collection agencies caught up with you." I turned and pointed at Trey, who was still kneeling on the floor, staring at the projected documents like a man watching his own execution. "And you succeeded," I said, a cold, hard smile playing on my lips. "You bagged the golden boy. You caught the heir to the Wilson megachurch dynasty. Except he was faking it too. You are 2 broke, desperate frauds who married each other thinking the other was the meal ticket. You tied yourselves to a sinking ship, and you fought over who got to steer." The truth landed with the force of a physical blow. Chloe's legs gave out beneath her. She slumped against the edge of the dining table, hiding her face behind her hands, weeping loudly in absolute humiliation. The facade was entirely destroyed. Trey slowly pushed himself up from the floor. He used the back of a ruined dining chair to steady his shaking legs. The shock on his bruised face morphed into something vicious and dark. He looked at his weeping wife. He looked at the documents projected on the wall, confirming that she was entirely worthless. "You lied to me!" Trey hissed, the words trembling with a sudden explosive rage. "You told me your father was transferring $1 million to our joint account after the baby was born." Chloe looked up, her tear-streaked face twisting into an ugly defensive snarl. "I had to say something, Trey. You were burning through cash. You were drowning." "You sunk me," Trey screamed, scrambling fully to his feet. He pointed a shaking, angry finger directly at her face. "You demanded the Cartier rings. You demanded the six-figure wedding to impress your fake friends. You forced me to rent that penthouse because the luxury apartment I had was not good enough for an heiress. I took out those bridge loans to pay for your lifestyle. I forged those church documents to keep you from leaving me." "Do not put this on me," Chloe shrieked back, her voice shrill and piercing. She shoved his hand away violently. "You are the criminal, Trey. You are the fraud. I wanted a husband who could provide. You sold me a fake business. You sold me a sneaker empire that did not exist. I am pregnant with the child of a bankrupt felon. You ruined my life." "You have no life!" Trey bellowed, his face turning bright red, his neck veins bulging. "You are Clarissa from Akron. You are a gold digger who dug into an empty mine. You drained every single cent I had left." The golden couple tore into each other with vicious, terrifying hatred. They screamed, their voices echoing off the high ceilings, hurling every secret, every lie, every bitter resentment they had buried beneath their designer clothes. They pushed and shoved each other amidst the ruined Thanksgiving dinner, entirely oblivious to the church elders watching in stunned, absolute horror. The screaming match between Trey and Chloe reached a deafening pitch. They were tearing at each other like feral animals trapped in a cage of their own making. Chloe shoved Trey hard against the wall, her manicured claws scratching at his ruined tuxedo shirt. Trey slapped her hands away, his face twisted in a pathetic mask of pure panic and betrayed entitlement. They were a beautiful, perfect high society disaster. I watched them tear each other apart for exactly 60 seconds. Then I reached over and tapped the screen of my phone. The mini projector clicked off. The stark white light vanished, plunging the formal dining room back into the dim, warm glow of the crystal chandelier. The sudden absence of the digital evidence seemed to suck the air right out of the room. The sudden silence was heavier than the screaming. Trey and Chloe froze, panting heavily, turning their terrified eyes back to me. "You are both exhausted," I said, my voice perfectly smooth, cutting through the heavy air like a razor blade. "And frankly, you are boring me. You can finalize your divorce in bankruptcy court. Right now, we have a much larger family matter to settle." I turned my gaze away from the ruined golden couple and locked eyes with my parents. Calvin and Delores were huddled near the head of the table. They looked like refugees standing in the wreckage of their own kingdom. The arrogance, the religious superiority, the untouchable wealth, it had all been stripped away, leaving nothing but two terrified aging frauds. "You thought the nightmare was over, Calvin?" I asked, stepping slowly toward him. "You thought Apex Holdings was just a corporate predator buying up your commercial debt? You thought the megachurch campus and this tacky suburban mansion were the only things your golden boy gambled away." Calvin swallowed hard, his prominent Adam apple bobbing in his thick throat. A fresh layer of cold sweat beaded across his forehead. "What else?" he whispered, his booming preacher voice reduced to a pathetic dry rasp. "What else did you take?" "I did not take anything," I corrected him sharply. "I bought what you threw away." I reached back into the matte black leather of my bag. I bypassed the shredded commercial applications. I pulled out a single pristine manila folder. It was older than the corporate dossiers, slightly worn at the edges but heavily protected. I did not drop this one on the table. I held it up, pressing it flat against my chest. "When you bundled the collateral, Trey," I said, keeping my eyes locked on Calvin, "you were sloppy. You were desperate. You threw every single asset attached to the Wilson name into the pot to keep the loan sharks from breaking your legs. You gave them the church campus. You gave them this mansion, and you gave them the deed to Big Mama House. A sharp, agonizing gasp tore out of Delores' throat. Her hands flew up to cover her mouth. Her eyes widened in absolute, unadulterated horror. Big Mama House was not just real estate. It was the historic Victorian home in the center of the city. It was the only piece of honest generational wealth this family possessed. It was the sacred family heirloom built by my great-grandparents, paid for in blood and sweat, and preserved through decades of struggle. It was the house Delores had sworn on a Bible to protect. It was the anchor of the Wilson legacy. And Trey had tossed it to underground lenders to pay for Chloe-rented diamonds. "No!" Delores wailed, her voice pitching high and breaking. "No, not the house, not the family home. Trey, you swore to me. You swore you never touched the historic trust." "He lied, Delores," I stated coldly. "He lied to you just like he lied to his investors, just like he lied to his wife. He leveraged the history of this family to buy himself a few more months of fake luxury." He handed Big Mama House over to monsters. I took a slow, deliberate step closer to my mother. The brown gravy drying on her silk dress smelled rancid. "But underground lenders do not want historic properties." I explained, my tone entirely conversational. "They do not want to deal with preservation societies and municipal zoning laws. They want liquid cash." So before my acquisitions team officially bought the commercial debt for Apex Holdings, I made a separate private transaction. I wired the money directly from my personal corporate accounts. I bought Big Mama House outright, free and clear. I opened the manila folder and pulled out the heavy notarized deed. I held it up to the chandelier light. "The historic trust is dissolved," I announced. "The property has been completely restructured. Big Mama House, the sacred family heirloom, the legacy you thought you could guard while you abused me, is now legally, strictly, and solely in my name. I own it. You have zero legal rights to step foot on that property ever again." The absolute finality of the statement crushed them. The final pillar of their false empire had just been kicked out from under them. Calvin's knees buckled. The massive, imposing patriarch of the megachurch simply collapsed. He dropped heavily to his knees, the impact shaking the floorboards. His expensive, tailored suit pooled awkwardly around him on the stained rug. He clasped his large hands together, raising them toward me in an attitude of desperate, desperate prayer. "Nia, please," Calvin begged. Real thick tears began to stream down his face, tracking through the sweat. Tears of absolute raw terror. "Blessed are the merciful, Nia. The scripture tells us to forgive. Vengeance belongs to the Lord. You cannot do this. We raised you in the church. We gave you your spiritual foundation. You cannot strike down the house of God. You cannot strike down your own father." Delores dropped to her knees right next to him. She did not care about the broken crystal digging into her shins. She did not care about the grease staining her skin. The high society queen was groveling in the dirt. She reached out with trembling hands, desperately trying to grasp the hem of my slacks. "Nia, please." Delores sobbed, her face completely distorted by panic. "You are our flesh and blood. You are my daughter. You cannot leave us with nothing. We will change. We will do whatever you want. Please do not take the family home. Please show us mercy." I looked down at them, the mighty Wilson parents weeping and begging at the feet of the daughter they had spent a lifetime trying to destroy. I felt a profound, deep satisfaction settle in my bones. It was a cold, wonderful feeling. "Flesh and blood," I repeated, looking directly into Delores' weeping eyes. 5 minutes ago you slapped me across the face and screamed that I was no longer your daughter. You told me I was nothing. You were willing to sacrifice my entire future to save your golden boy. Do not dare talk to me about flesh and blood. Do not dare invoke the family name. You burned this family to the ground the day you decided my life was collateral for his ego." I shifted my gaze to Calvin. The praying hands, the scripture quoting it, was all just another manipulation tactic. "And do not quote scripture to me, Calvin," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You built a house of greed and pride. You used the pulpit to line your own pockets. You used the congregation to fund your luxury cars. I am not striking down the house of God. I am the consequence of your own sins. I am just the collection agency." I stepped back, pulling my leg away before Delores could touch my clothing. I looked at the four of them, broken, weeping, destroyed. They were completely at my mercy, and they knew I possessed none. I reached into the Birkin bag one final time. I pulled out a thick-bound legal document. It was not a deed. It was not a loan application. It was a dense, complicated binding contract. The pages were stark white, the legal jargon dense and impenetrable. I held it up. "This is a final settlement agreement," I announced. "Apex Holdings is willing to restructure the commercial debt. I am willing to keep the mega church campus out of foreclosure. I am willing to keep Trey out of federal prison. But it comes with a price." I dropped the heavy contract right next to the shattered crystal on the table. It landed with a definitive, heavy thud. "You want salvation?" I asked, looking down at my groveling parents. "This is the devil contract. Read the terms. You have exactly 5 minutes to sign it, or I call the federal authorities and I call the moving trucks. The choice is yours." Calvin stared at the thick stack of paper. His trembling fingers hovered over the pristine white pages as if they were ablaze. He did not want to touch it. He did not want to acknowledge the physical manifestation of his complete ruin. The heavy silence in the dining room was broken only by the sound of Chloe ragged, hyperventilating breaths and Trey quiet, pathetic sobbing. "Read it." "Calvin," I commanded, my voice slicing through the thick air. "Read the terms of your salvation." He slowly pulled the document toward him. Delores leaned in her tear-soaked face, hovering over his shoulder. I watched their eyes scan the first page. I watched the remaining color drain completely from their faces. The legal jargon was dense, but the absolute destruction of their lives was spelled out in plain, undeniable English. "Let me save you the trouble of translating the legalese," I said, pacing slowly behind Trey and Chloe. "Clause 1 pertains to the golden couple." Trey flinched, pulling his knees to his chest. Chloe looked up, her eyes darting wildly like a cornered animal calculating a non-existent escape route. "You are vacating these premises tonight," I stated, my voice echoing against the high ceiling. "You are not packing boxes. You are not calling a moving company. You are leaving tonight with exactly what you brought into this world. Nothing." Chloe let out a strangled gasp. "You cannot do that. It is freezing outside. We have nowhere to go. I am carrying your nephew." "You are carrying the product of 2 felons, I corrected her sharply, stepping directly into her line of sight. "And you will raise that child in whatever shelter accepts fraudulent dropshippers. You will leave the keys on this table. You will leave the leased vehicles in the driveway. You will leave the designer clothes in the closets. You will leave the watches. You will leave the wedding bands paid for with stolen money. You will walk out that front door in the garments currently on your backs, and you never return. If you attempt to take a single asset from this property, my private security team waiting outside will detain you for theft." Trey buried his face in his hands. He did not look at his wife. He did not look at his parents. The reality of his absolute destitution was finally breaking him. The golden boy was reduced to a weeping, shivering mess on a gravy-stained rug. Clause 2. I continued, turning my attention back to the head of the table. "Calvin and Delores, you get to stay." Delores let out a massive, shuddering sigh of relief. "Thank you, Jesus," she whispered, her hands clasping together in a desperate prayer. "Thank you, Nia." I held up a single finger, stopping her mid-prayer. "You get to stay as my tenants." I clarified, my tone dropping to absolute zero. "You will live in this house under my rules, but in exchange you will sever all ties to me. You will sign away any and all future parental rights. You will sign away any claim to my estate. You will sign away any legal standing to ever make medical or financial decisions on my behalf. You will sign away your title as my family. You will legally become strangers to me." Calvin looked up, his eyes hollow and defeated. "You are asking us to disown ourselves. I am legally formalizing what you did to me emotionally decades ago," I countered, stepping closer to the table. "You disowned me the moment I showed an ounce of independence. You disowned me when you prioritized a criminal over your own daughter. You disowned me when you let her slap me across the face. I'm just putting it on paper." I tapped the heavy contract with my index finger. "But that is not all. Appended to that section is a full sworn confession. You will sign a detailed admission of your complicity in Trey fraud. You will admit to knowing he forged the documents. You will admit to covering up the theft of the historic trust. You will admit to every lie you told to protect your precious image. You will sign it, and I will hold it in a secure vault. If you ever cross me, if you ever attempt to contact me outside of official tenant business, that confession goes straight to the district attorney. Delores shook her head frantically, her perfectly coiffed hair falling in wet, tangled strands across her face. We cannot sign that. It will ruin us. If that gets out, we will lose everything. Our friends, our standing, our entire life. You have already lost everything, Delores, I stated plainly. You are just negotiating the terms of your surrender. Sign the paper and you keep a roof over your head. Refuse and you join Trey and Chloe on the sidewalk tonight. I let the silence hang, letting the absolute weight of their utter defeat settle deeply into their bones. They were trapped. They were cornered, and they knew it. There was no maneuvering, no manipulating, no praying their way out of a legally binding execution. Calvin picked up the expensive gold pen resting near his plate. His hand was shaking violently. He looked at the signature line. He looked at his ruined son, crying on the floor. He looked at his weeping wife. Slowly, heavily, he brought the pen down to the paper. "Wait," I said. Calvin froze the nib of the pen, hovering a millimeter above the signature line. He looked up at me, a fresh wave of panic pooling in his eyes. "There is one final condition," I said. Clause 3. The most important one. I walked slowly back to the head of the table. I leaned down, placing both of my hands flat on the mahogany surface, bringing my face inches from my father. I looked directly into the eyes of the great Pastor Calvin Wilson, the man who commanded thousands, the man who spoke with the voice of God, the man who built an empire on righteous hypocrisy. "You leveraged the sanctuary." Calvin, I whispered the words, slipping out with venomous precision. "You let your son mortgage the house of worship to pay off street thugs. I bought that debt. I own the church. I hold the padlock and the chain." He squeezed his eyes shut, tears leaking from the corners. "I know," he rasped, his voice barely audible. "You are going to save your church," I told him. "You are going to stand at the pulpit this Sunday. You are going to look out at the thousands of people who trust you, who fund your lifestyle, who believe your lies. You are going to look at your entire congregation, and you are going to confess." Calvin's eyes snapped open wide with absolute terror. "No." "Yes," I commanded, my voice rising, echoing with finality. "You will stand before your flock. You will confess your greed. You will confess your complicity. You will confess your failure. You will confess that you nearly lost the sanctuary because of your own pride. You will strip yourself of your false righteousness, and you will beg your congregation for forgiveness." "I cannot," he choked out violently, shaking his head, his massive shoulders trembling. "I cannot do that. They will turn on me. The elders will strip me of my title. I will be ruined." "You will confess this Sunday," I repeated, leaning closer, my voice dropping to a deadly steady rhythm. "You will expose every lie. You will shatter the illusion. Or on Monday morning, I execute the foreclosure. On Monday morning, I chain the doors shut. On Monday morning, I bring in the bulldozers, and I turn your legacy into a parking lot." I stood up straight, adjusting the cuffs of my blazer, looking down at the broken man before me. "Sign the contract, Calvin. Confess on Sunday, or lose it all right now." The gold pen hovered for one final agonizing second before Calvin pressed it to the paper. The scratching of the nib echoed loudly in the silent room. He signed away his pride. He signed away his legacy. He signed away the daughter he had spent a lifetime trying to break. Delores took the pen next. Her hand shook so violently she could barely form the letters of her own name. She signed away her comfort. She signed away her social standing. She signed away the illusion of her perfect family. I pulled the contract back, sliding it safely into my leather bag. I raised my hand and snapped my fingers twice. The heavy oak doors of the dining room swung open. 3 men in immaculate black suits walked in. My private security team. They did not carry weapons. They carried thick, heavy-duty black trash bags. They dropped the bags at the feet of Trey and Chloe. "You have 5 minutes," I told my brother. "Whatever fits in the bag goes with you. Everything else stays." Chloe let out a blood-curdling scream. She scrambled toward the hallway, her expensive heels slipping on the hardwood floor. The security guards followed them up the grand staircase. The next 5 minutes were a symphony of pure, unadulterated panic. I stood at the bottom of the stairs listening to drawers being ripped open. I listened to Chloe sobbing over designer dresses she could not fit into the plastic. I listened to Trey begging the guards for just one more minute. They did not get one more minute. Exactly 300 seconds later, the guards marched them back down the stairs. Trey was wearing his ruined tuxedo, dragging a bulging trash bag behind him. Chloe was wearing a silk slip dress, clutching a bag so tightly her knuckles were white. "Open the door," I instructed. A guard pulled open the massive mahogany front doors. The night air whipped inside violently. It was pouring, a torrential, freezing Atlanta downpour. There was no valet waiting. There was no leased Porsche in the circular driveway. There was only the long, dark walk down to the front gates. Trey hesitated at the threshold, looking out into the pitch-black storm. He looked back at Calvin. "Dad," he whimpered. "Dad, please." Calvin did not look at him. Calvin stared firmly at the floor, his jaw clenched shut. "Get out," I said. The guards stepped forward, forcing them over the threshold and slamming the heavy doors shut behind them. I stood by the front window watching them drag their garbage bags through the freezing rain. The rain washed away the Vanderbilt heiress. The rain washed away the sneaker mogul. The rain washed away every single lie they had ever told. They were nothing but two shadows swallowed by the storm. 48 hours later, the sun broke through the clouds over the Wilson Mega Church campus. The sanctuary was an architectural marvel of glass and steel, built to hold 8,000 worshipers. Every single velvet seat was filled. The massive high-definition screens mounted above the altar projected a perfect, pristine image of the cross. The choir finished a soaring, thunderous hymn, and the congregation settled into a reverent, expectant hush. They were waiting for a miracle. They were waiting for an uplifting message of prosperity and grace. Calvin walked up the short flight of stairs to the clear acrylic pulpit. He did not look like a mighty patriarch. He looked like a dead man walking. His skin was an unhealthy, chalky gray. Heavy beads of sweat rolled down his forehead, soaking into the collar of his stiff white shirt. His hands gripped the edges of the pulpit so tightly the acrylic creaked under the pressure. Down in the front row, reserved for the pastoral family, Delores sat frozen. She wore a wide-brimmed black hat, pulled low over her face, her body shrinking into the velvet upholstery, trying to make herself completely invisible. Beside her sat the 12 members of the church board of elders, their faces serene and expectant. Calvin leaned into the microphone. A harsh blast of static cracked through the massive speakers, making thousands of people jump. "I stand before you today, a broken man." Calvin began, his voice lacking its usual booming theatrical resonance. His voice was a thin, rattling croak. "I stand before you to confess." A ripple of confused murmurs washed over the front rows. "I have preached prosperity while practicing deceit," Calvin said, reading from a typed statement he pulled from his breast pocket. "I have preached integrity while hiding a rotting core of corruption. I have stolen from this house of worship." The murmurs stopped. A dead, heavy silence fell over the 8,000 people in the room. My son Trey accrued millions of dollars in fraudulent commercial debt. Calvin read, his voice shaking violently now. To protect his image and to protect my own pride, I allowed him to use the sanctuary as collateral. I allowed him to mortgage the very ground you sit on to pay off predatory underground lenders. I risked the house of God to save a criminal. Someone in the balcony let out a loud, sharp gasp. The board of elders in the front row stiffened, their serene expressions instantly hardening into shock and fury. "But my sins go back much further," Calvin confessed, tears finally spilling over his eyelids, blinding him under the harsh stage lights. "I am a thief. Years ago, I drained my own daughter's college tuition fund to cover my catastrophic personal investments. I stole her future because I believed she was just a worker bee who did not deserve a pristine education. I stole her money and I justified it with scripture. And when the church funds ran low, I took your tithes. I took your offerings. I took the money you gave in faith, and I gambled it away to maintain the illusion of my perfect wealthy family. The silence shattered. It broke like a pane of glass hit by a sledgehammer. A woman in the third row stood up and screamed. A wave of outrage, fury, and absolute betrayal ripped through the sanctuary. 8,000 voices erupted at once, echoing off the glass and steel walls in a deafening roar of condemnation. Delores buried her face entirely in her hands, weeping hysterically as the congregation turned their furious eyes toward the front pew. The chairman of the Board of Elders, an imposing man with a stern face, leaped out of his seat. He did not wait for Calvin to finish the statement. He marched directly up the altar steps, his face purple with rage. He shoved Calvin aside roughly and grabbed the microphone, pulling it from the stand. "You are a disgrace," the chairman roared into the microphone, his voice booming over the chaotic, screaming crowd. "You are a thief and a liar. By the authority of this board, you are stripped of your title immediately. You are no longer the pastor of this church. Security, escort this man off the altar." 2 uniformed church security guards ran up the steps. They grabbed Calvin by the arms. The great patriarch did not fight back. He dropped his head in absolute humiliation, letting them drag him away from the pulpit while his congregation screamed for his head. I watched the entire chaotic spectacle unfold in high definition from the plush back seat of my chauffeur-driven Maybach. The heavy soundproof glass of the luxury vehicle completely isolated me from the morning traffic of downtown Atlanta. The only sound in the pristine leather interior was the tinny, frantic screaming coming from the speakers of my iPad. The camera angle on the church livestream jerked wildly as the production team scrambled to cut the feed. But they were too late. The damage was permanent and highly public. I watched my father being physically removed from the altar he had worshipped more than any deity. I watched Delores scrambling up the center aisle, shielding her face with her expensive handbag, fleeing from the very people she had looked down upon for decades. I watched the golden empire of the Wilson family crumble into absolute dust. It was not a sudden explosion. It was a demolition. A perfectly executed, controlled demolition that I had engineered down to the final wire. I did not smile. I did not gloat. The crushing heavy weight that I had carried since childhood simply dissolved. The ghost of the scapegoat daughter vanished entirely. I reached out and tapped the screen of the iPad. The chaotic screaming vanished instantly, replaced by the quiet hum of the Maybach engine. It was over. The debt was collected. The generational curse was finally broken. The long black car slowed, gliding smoothly to a halt, in front of a towering structure of reflective glass and dark steel. This was not a rented suburban warehouse. This was not a fraudulent shell company built on forged signatures. This was Apex Holdings. This was the reality I had built from the ground up while they were busy maintaining a fragile illusion. Marcus, my driver, stepped out and opened my door. The crisp morning air hit my face as I stepped onto the pavement. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored blazer and walked through the heavy revolving glass doors. The atmosphere inside the corporate headquarters was electric but highly disciplined. As I walked across the polished marble floor of the massive lobby, the energy shifted. It was not the fearful groveling my father demanded from his congregation, nor the fake sycophancy Chloe bought with stolen credit cards. It was the sharp, alert respect earned by a leader who actually built the ground they stood on. People moved with purpose. "Good morning, Ms. Wilson. Good morning, Nia." The greetings followed me to the private executive elevator. I stepped inside, riding up to the top floor. My corner office overlooked the entire city skyline. It was a stark contrast to the stifling dark wood and oppressive floral wallpaper of my parents' house. Here, everything was light and glass and absolute clarity. My lead legal counsel, Sarah, was waiting by my desk. She had a thick stack of folders perfectly aligned next to my morning coffee. "The final paperwork for the restructuring is complete," she said, handing me the first file. "The church board has formally accepted the new debt terms and ousted Calvin. The property transfers for the suburban estate and the historic home are completely finalized. The locks were changed at midnight. I signed the last page, sliding it back to her. The Wilsons were now officially a closed file. I pulled the second, much thicker folder toward me. The cover was embossed with a brand new logo, the Big Mama Educational Trust. "We are ready to launch the inaugural grant cycle," Sarah noted, watching my face carefully. "The initial funding is locked and secured. We can cover full 4-year tuition, room and board for 100 young Black women heading into university STEM and finance programs this fall." I opened the file, running my fingers over the pristine documents. This was the real victory. Not the destruction of my father, but the creation of this trust. I was taking the money they had stolen, the wealth they had hoarded to maintain their arrogant facade, and I was giving it to girls exactly like I used to be. Girls who were told they were just worker bees. Girls who were told their only purpose was to fund the dreams of entitled men who contributed absolutely nothing. Girls who were called the help simply because they chose to work hard rather than pretend. "No one else will ever have their tuition stolen," I said, my voice steady and certain, echoing in the quiet office. "We launch it tomorrow. Put the press release out. I want this foundation completely insulated from the apex corporate structure. This money is untouchable." Sarah nodded, gathering the files into her arms. She gave me a warm, genuine smile before exiting the office, closing the heavy glass door softly behind her. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the sprawling city. I had secured my legacy. I had reclaimed the house my great-grandparents built. I had purged the poison from my bloodline. The silence in the office was absolute perfection. Then my personal cell phone buzzed on the glass desk. A harsh, vibrating sound that broke the absolute quiet. I turned slowly, walking back to the desk. I looked down at the bright screen. The caller ID flashed a single name: Delores. She was probably standing in the rain outside a locked house. She was probably panicking, realizing the credit cards were completely frozen, realizing the church bank accounts were seized, realizing that the daughter she had slapped and discarded was the only person left on earth who could save her. She was calling to beg. She was calling to invoke the very family loyalty she had weaponized against me for 30 years. I picked up the phone, holding it in the palm of my hand. The device vibrated steadily, a desperate mechanical heartbeat. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel anger. I felt nothing at all for the woman calling me. I stared at the name on the glowing screen. "Family over everything," I whispered, repeating the sacred Wilson mantra to the empty room. "Sacrifice is your duty." I swiped my thumb across the screen. I hit reject. I opened the contact settings and I pressed delete. The name vanished. The history vanished. The burden was completely gone. I set the phone face down on the glass desk and turned back to the window, watching the morning light wash over my city. The screen fades to black.